talk about the rest of the agenda and we can go from there.
Great. Thanks, members. It's good to see everybody. I just wanted to take a quick moment to welcome our new fellow, Simone Wright, who has joined us on the chat, is here. She is fellowing from Atlanta, Georgia, and is a student at Harvard, and has already done some really great work, and we're really excited to work with her over the summer. So I just wanted to make sure that you had an opportunity to wave at her face as we go through these this process. So thanks, Ruth.
All right, and Simone, I take it you are not in DC now, or are you?
I am currently not in DC, but because I'm working from home. Otherwise, I would be in DC. So I'm currently in Atlanta, Georgia, but I live in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I'm at my family's home.
Well, welcome. Where everybody's in, who knows where anybody is at this point. All right. So anyway, welcome. All right. So we're going to start with a discussion of the reopening. And let me just say, we've talked about this at a couple of meetings. We've talked about doing surveys. We've talked about a town hall, especially around special ed, but also broadly. We've had the public testimony last month about a lot of the issues going on. We've talked about the special ed issues in particular. So staff was beginning to pull some stuff together. Fraser put out an email, I guess, last week on really trying to make this a key focus of what we do in the next period. There were responses to that, including really getting closer on this idea that a useful report for us to do would be to consolidate the other reports that are out there and really crosswalk them with the kind of testimony we've been hearing so that we really have an understanding about what's being proposed, what other people are saying, what's missing, what some of the conflicts are. And I think that came, if I'm remembering right, from a mix of Jessica and Emily, that idea of the report. In addition, people have talked about the need, an important role for us is to create a space where people who aren't being heard can express what's going on, which is a more intimate way of what we had talked about doing in a survey, really trying to understand what's going out and understanding how that is or isn't in line what everybody is doing. So tonight, what we're going to do is we're going to start with a video presentation from Sarah, who you know has left, but she did a walkthrough of many of the surveys that have been undertaken by various players in DC and out. And we're going to hear her sort of talk about what she found, what they looked for, and we can get some ideas about how we might fill in there if that's a way we choose to go. Then we're going to break. We're going to talk with Chancellor Farabee. Then when we come back, I'll say a little bit, and maybe Darren will, about an outline that he's put together of this consolidated report. And then from there, we'll go into a discussion, and we'll have a good 15, 20 minutes to sort of get some responses from people about how we are going to proceed on this and what is the most valuable, viable way for us to engage people and make this all go better than it might go otherwise. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to John Paul to queue up the report from Sarah. Am I right, John Paul? That's where we're at? Okay.
Hello everyone, my name is Sarah Arrington and I'm a Policy Fellow for the State Board of Education. And tonight I will be discussing the staff's findings on the COVID-19 distance learning survey interviews. A little bit of an overview. The project began at the beginning of May, and it was in response to some of the board members expressing interest in conducting a survey to assess the challenges that community members are facing due to distance learning. And so the staff reached out to 11 organizations, and in order to assess their surveys, the topics that they learned about and what they would like to know more about so that the state board can build off of that work. Of those 11 organizations, 7 responded and agreed to be interviewed. I will briefly review the findings from those interviews and then discuss key takeaways and recommendations for the board. The purpose of this research is to understand other organizations' research regarding the effects of COVID-19 distance learning, determine where and how the state board can add value to this research, and identify topics and populations that the state board should focus its research on. Here's a word cloud created from the memo that synthesizes the findings of all the interviews. There's a few terms that really stand out in this word cloud. So at the bottom right here is tech, and then closely related is usage, issues, and access. So these topics, tech usage, tech issues, and tech access, came up a lot in the surveys and in the interviews. Understanding if students have tech devices, if they have access to Wi-Fi, if they have support for any issues that they have, are all key themes throughout the interviews. Another word that stands out is SPED right here on the right. And that is because many of the organizations recognize that they did not target SPED students or other special populations of students. And so that's important to understand because we need to be keeping in mind who is filling out these surveys and whose voices are coming through in the findings. And then finally, right in the middle, the word fall is fairly large because many of the surveys asked about transitioning back to school in the fall and what parents and family preferences were for schedules when that does happen. The first interview was with the Ward 3 Wilson Feeder Education Network, and they targeted everybody on their listserv, so that's going to be a lot of people from Ward 3. But they recognized that the people that are filling out the survey are probably not the people with the most critical needs, and so they kept that in mind as they reviewed their findings. The survey was sent out at the beginning of April, specifically the 3rd week of distance learning. So that's really getting a sense of that initial few weeks when we transitioned into distance learning. Some of the areas that they discovered in their survey that they would like to know more about included content delivery, specifically schools that are using multiple platforms to deliver content to students, and how that is difficult for students and families to navigate. So you can see here on this screenshot right here, there's a number of different platforms that classrooms have been using to deliver content. And so the Ward 3 Education Network is pushing for a streamlined platform so that students only have to learn how to use one. Next, they wanted to know more about tech support. So specifically, did students and families need tech support during distance learning? And if they did, who did they ask for help? Did they receive that help? These types of questions they would like to know more about. And then finally, distance learning packets. So they wanted to know about the value of these packets and whether families and students were using them. They found out that the real value came when teachers and students were not able to connect online, but other than that, they had very little value because they were often not aligned with the work that the students were doing in their classrooms. Their suggestions for the state board were to look into tech usage and content delivery training for teachers so that if teachers know how to use the devices and the tech and the platforms, then they will be able to teach better with those devices and they will be able to help students learn how to use them as well. And then finally, closing the digital divide. So the Ward 3 Education Network is pushing for a 1-to-1 ratio of device to students because even when we transition back to school in the fall, it's clear that using technology is going to be a standard for our classrooms. The next survey was with the Office of the Student Advocate. Their survey targeted students, but they recognized that they were not targeting SPED students or parents or special populations. But they really did want to get a sense of the general experience of students during COVID-19 and distance learning. They sent out the survey during mid-May and is actually still live until the beginning of July. So they don't have their findings yet, but they did share some of the topics that they would like to know more about. The first is COVID-19 and public health, so specifically how students are affected by family members and people that are close to them testing positive for COVID and the trauma that that might bring. Also, what students are experiencing during the quarantine and if they're losing space because of it. Next was tech usage. Similar to the previous interview, they wanted to know about devices, Wi-Fi, and supports, all regarding tech. Last was sibling experiences. So specifically, whether one sibling had to help another sibling with their academics and whether that took time away from the first sibling. Also, if siblings had to share devices and if that took time away from them and their learning time. Their suggestions included partnering with community organizations to really get that outreach and to reach multiple groups, student groups. Next was to keep the survey under 20 questions. They expressed that once a survey is longer than that, many times people will stop filling it out because it is a burden. Next was ranking questions because they're useful and it gives you more insight than a multiple choice question might. Recognizing the burden of a survey, especially for special populations, this has to do with re-traumatizing students and if you ask them about the trauma that they've undergone. And that's similar to the last suggestion, which is to be intentional with survey questions. So recognizing that this is not an easy thing to discuss or share, and so being really intentional about how we go about doing that. The next interview was with the Prichard Committee Student Voice Team, and this organization is actually based in Kentucky. And we reached out to them in order to get a sense of what another state was doing to assess the community needs and experiences during distance learning. They targeted middle and high school students in Kentucky, so it was a very large survey. They had thousands of responses. They sent this out at the beginning of May, and so they did not have their responses and their findings yet either, but they were able to share some of the topics they would like to know more about. The first is mental health. So specifically, how has mental health changed since distance learning started, and what supports are schools providing to help students? Next is student engagement. So they wanted to know what motivated students to go online and engage with the classroom and their teachers, and what kept them motivated to complete their schoolwork. And then finally, once again, looking at tech problems, tech devices, Wi-Fi, support, who's providing that support, who has devices, who doesn't. Their suggestions included using open-ended questions, which provide more insight than multiple choice. Also, they really liked that we have a student advisory committee, and so they stressed that using the SAC to develop the survey could be a really good choice. And also they suggested that conducting surveys become part of the SAC's signature role with the board. Next was to keep a 10-minute time limit. So once again, keeping it short so it's not so much of a burden to fill out. Translating the survey and printing out paper copies, both equity and access to the survey. And then finally, utilizing partnerships with other organizations for that outreach and making sure that we get a representative selection of students. The next survey was with the Washington Teachers Union, and their survey was very short. It was only 2 questions. They targeted teachers and specifically union member teachers, so they did not target non-members, which of course means a lot of charter school teachers. But they asked about student engagement and teacher preferences for starting back in the fall. And so for that student engagement aspect, they wanted to know more about how many students were logging on regularly and how teachers were engaging them. And for the teacher preferences, you can see in the screenshot right here, about 50% of teachers who responded wanted to continue distance learning for the remainder of the school year and start as scheduled in August. And a good amount of teachers actually wanted to end distance learning early. The second aspect that they would like to know more about involves the effectiveness of using TV for distance learning. So that's very specific to WTU because they were using cable to provide academic content for families. And then finally, using tech, did students have devices, Wi-Fi, and supports, and how we are going to provide that in the fall. Their suggestions included utilizing partnerships with other organizations to outreach and make sure we're getting a representative sample, which is the second suggestion. And then third, being aware that DCPS and PCSB might not want to hear negative feedback because that has been their experience with those two agencies. Next is the interview with PAVE. And so their survey targeted parents and caregivers to assess the challenges that they have been experiencing. Their survey was live for the first 2 weeks of April. So again, that is very early on in distance learning. So one of the areas that they wanted to know more about is how COVID-19 impacts have changed since the beginning of distance learning. As you can see in this screenshot, there are 3 topics highlighted that those were the top 3 challenges that parents identified in this survey. The next area they would like to explore further is student engagement. So understanding what keeps students engaged in distance learning and specifically what parents preferred was a good amount of time for different age groups of students. So how long should different grades be required to sit and do distance learning? The next one was special populations, and they specifically wanted to know about SPED students and the services that they were receiving or were not receiving during distance learning. So which ones continued as that transition happened and who was providing it, were there enough supports, things like that. Next was back to school. So they wanted to know parents' preferences for what the fall schedule should look like. And then finally, tech usage once again, so devices, Wi-Fi, and supports. Their suggestions included using qualitative data because it provides more insight than multiple choice data. Translating the survey, that gets to that equity aspect again. Ranking questions are hard to report on, so they suggested asking, instead of asking families to rank something, just asking them, what is your most challenging aspect of X? And then finally, having staff available so people can call in and actually fill out the survey over the phone. And once again, this really hits at that equity and access piece, making sure that anybody who is targeted in this survey is able to fill out the survey. Next interview was with Education Forward DC, and their interview actually was not specifically COVID-19 distance learning related. They were targeting district policymakers, including DC Council, the State Board, the DME, Mayor's Office, OSSE, and all 8 education councils. And they added one COVID-19 related question, which was asking these agencies what they thought the most important education issues are at that time, which was sent out at the beginning of April, so right when distance learning was started. And here are some of the responses that they received. So some things that we have been seeing already: equity and access, well-being, also mental health, capacity of older caregivers, academic recuperation, which really it's at how we are going to get our students to where they need to be in the fall. Next is supporting marginalized and SPED students, planning for school closures. So again, in the fall, if we have to close schools again, what is that going to look like? Making sure we have a plan. Next, examining other regions' actions. And then finally, rethinking DC government structure. So and that would be the mayoral control aspect. They did not feel like they were in a position to ask anything else about COVID-19 and distance learning. So they left it as one question. And then finally, the last interview was about the Office of the Deputy Mayor for Education survey, but it was actually, the interview was actually with somebody who works at Education Forward DC. He was on the team that put together this survey for the DME, and so he provided us some insight, but he does not, of course, speak for the DME. The DME survey targeted parents and families, and it was sent out at the end of May. So now we're getting a little bit of a insight into the end of distance learning and how families are faring once it's been, a few weeks. The first area that they would like to know more about is the impact of COVID-19 over time. So even though we're now getting this view into the end of distance learning, it's still a point in time in survey. So really they highlighted the need to be regularly checking in with families and parents and not just having this one point in time survey to make all the decisions. And then next was back to school. So as you can see in this screenshot right here, wards 7 and 8 had the most people respond that they would prefer to continue with distance learning. And then the other wards had more people respond that they would rather go back to in-person learning. So they really highlighted the need to create a plan for back to school so that people know what's going on. And then finally, tech usage once again. So devices, Wi-Fi, and supports. Their suggestions included looking into families' abilities to meet basic needs and also mental health needs. So while these are not specifically education related, they are extremely connected to students' abilities to perform academically and so need to be addressed. And then finally, looking at long-term effects of distance learning. So they stressed that many surveys are going around about the immediate needs and preferences of families, but we need to be focusing on the future as well so that we can quickly pivot once we start school again in the fall and beyond that. Some key takeaways include the need for targeting special populations to hear their voices and their needs. Also tech usage and tech problems, of course, mental health and trauma. So creating a plan for how we're going to support students' mental health and help them work through the trauma that they might have experienced due to COVID-19. Next is student engagement. So engaging students, whether that's in person or through distance learning, but having a plan for what that looks like. And then finally, back to school, having a plan for what we will be doing when we go back to school, and also incorporating parent and family voices into that plan. The best practices takeaway include having a time limit or a fairly short survey, using open-ended questions because they provide more insight, translation and access. So access could come in the form of printing out the survey or having somebody on the phone willing to help somebody go through the survey. Utilizing partnerships for outreach, and this will also help get a representative sample of whatever population that we're targeting. Next is recognizing the survey fatigue and burden. So this has to do with the fact that there are a lot of surveys out there. And so it's the survey fatigue comes when we are consistently asking families to fill out surveys and not utilizing the surveys that have already been conducted. Next is being intentional with questions. So this kind of gets at the trauma aspect and not asking students to relive trauma that they've already experienced by asking about that trauma. And if we do have to, then being intentional about how we ask that. And then finally, making sure we're reaching the most critical populations. So getting their voices heard through this survey and finding strategies and ways to make sure that they are able to fill out the survey. And then 2 overarching recommendations. The first is focusing research efforts on creating a plan and elevating the voices of the community for transitioning back to school. And then, of course, there's many aspects of that plan that would need to be included. In-person versus virtual learning or a combination, tech devices and support, special populations, getting their voices heard, and then mental health supports. And the second recommendation is focusing research efforts on supporting communities after the transition back to school. So really being prepared to hear from the community about the new challenges that are arising, what is working, what is not working, and being able to quickly pivot the plan and the supports to accommodate that. And that's it. Thank you so much for allowing me to work on this project. I know that the work that you do to help these families is going to be amazing and really impactful, and I am very proud to be a part of it. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Sarah. Sarah is gone, but that was really terrific. So in case you're watching, Sarah, that was great. John Paul, it is 5:28 or 8. Do we expect the chancellor right at 5:30?
I believe so, yes.
All right, so here's what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the liberty of very quickly summarizing the report that Darren has sent out to you. You all just got this. I understand it. I'm going to do some highlights. People are going to have a chance to look at it. And then when we come back after talking with the chancellor, we'll consider Darren's outline. We'll consider what Sarah proposed, and we'll all sort of get in there about how we take this forward. So let me just say, in terms of Darren's summary, Darren. Oh, the chancellor's here. Hello, Chancellor.
Hello, good afternoon. How are you?
I'm fine. Welcome to our meeting, and thank you so much for joining us. Well, I guess I don't have to introduce you. I think we all know you. So, and my understanding is you're going to start with about 10 minutes or so of comments, and then you're here with us for 45 minutes, so we have a half an hour or so to put some questions to you.
Yes, and just checking, is this the right time? I don't want to impede on.
Absolutely perfect. You're, I think, 30 seconds early, so we're delighted.
Okay, perfect. So should I dive right in?
Go for it.
Okay, so again, thank you for the invitation to address the board and share some of the work that DCPS is doing and respond to some questions. So we recently, as you know, celebrated the class of 2020. We ideally would have liked to have in-person graduation, but we did celebrate the class virtually. And we're excited to launch our DC Persist initiative thanks to a $10 million investment that DCPS received from the Clark Foundation. This allows us to follow our graduates, beginning with the class of 2020, into their higher education journey with a very robust focus on their freshman and sophomore years. Over 700 students will receive one-on-one coaching and supports through their college experience. Students will also have access to mini grants that can support the purchase of textbooks, the purchase of technology that they may need, transportation to and from campus. And so what we heard from some of our students is, sometimes even though they may have scholarship support, they still may need the ability to have some financial assistance. So we're really excited that we're able to build a alumni database and regular newsletters and resources going out to our high school students and their graduates. And this is a part of our strategy to build upon the college and career guides that we provided to our students. We're also really thrilled that we are moving through a budget process that was very favorable and represents a $79 million increase for fiscal year 20, thanks to the mayor's proposal for our budget. You can imagine how many school systems are seeing an increase in their budget during this time. The budget also represents what schools develop in collaboration with their LSATs in the spring, and we're pleased that schools were able to maintain those resources as we think about reopening for this school year. It's important to note the budget also includes $3.4 million in targeted assistance and what we're calling the Chancellor Assistance Fund. This is the first of the kind for me to just identify gaps and provide additional dollars to schools. And then of the budget assistance requests from schools, we were also able to allocate another $6.1 million to schools. And in addition to the investments in schools, we are really excited about our enhancements, which is allowing us to continue our connected school model, which provides a plethora of wraparound support services, including wellness, behavior supports, child care assistance, and financial assistance referrals to families. We're also able to advance this next phase of our Empowered Learners Initiative. This is where we are investing additional technology, particularly devices for students. This represents a $6.9 million budget item for fiscal year 20, which will allow us to purchase approximately 11,000 new devices for students. And we're excited that students will be able to have access to these devices, we believe, as we start the 2021 school year. We're also investing in early literacy interventions just to ensure that we're continuing to reach all of our K-2 students and our goal of all students in K through 2 reading on grade level by 2022. On top of that, we're still maintaining our mental health investments. DCPS has maintained and strengthened our commitment to mental health supports in schools. We know that this is even more important in supporting social, emotional, and academic development of students as we continue to deal with the challenges and implications of COVID-19 and the importance of staying focused on student and staff well-being. This was also a part of our 2-week professional development session. So we ended school the end of May, and we utilized the time in June to provide a 2-week professional learning session for teachers that was focused on mental health and also preparing educators for a hybrid learning posture as we think about the reopening of the 2021 school year. And then finally, we have done a lot of work to ensure that we're offering the appropriate summer programming, and we're preparing to open school in August. And so for summer programming, we're offering those options primarily in a virtual posture, which includes K-2 literacy supports, enrichment at the elementary level, and then the ability for our secondary students to take courses towards graduation. We're currently enrolling families now for the Summer Bridge option, which is our first opportunity for in-person should health conditions allow. This is focused on our transition grades 3, 6, and 9. The goal here is to start the school year for those students and begin to build relationship between students to students and students and adults. And this will be offered at every school in grades 3, 6, and 9. Grade 3, we believe this is important because this is the phase in which students are transitioning from many cases a self-contained all-day model to some departmentalization experiences with multiple educators. We're also thinking about our sixth graders, those students that are transitioning to middle school, and then our ninth graders that are transitioning into high school. We also have had a number of touch points with families and staff throughout the spring and summer to better understand how we perform in the last few months of last school year in the spring, and then how we should be thinking about plans for the opening of the 2021 school year and to open strong. That included some focus groups, included a number of surveys to staff, students, and families. Our most recent survey was to staff. And then this week, we've launched some additional guidance to staff about leave and some of the safety protocols that will be in place for the 2021 school year. We will share with families in the coming weeks the proposed schedule for the 2021 school year. We're still slated to start on August 31st and believe that we will have some type of hybrid and virtual only option for families to choose from. So I stopped there. I think I've used just about most of my 10 minutes that I've been given, and wonder if there any particular topic that I had an opportunity to address that you would like to hear from me, and then if not, we can go into questions.
John Paul, I assume you're going to call for questions because you've got the pictures of the hands, but I will say, I do think there is going to be a lot of interest in the reopening and the plans for that. So I don't know if you want to give a 1 or 2 minute summary of that, or just let us ask our questions on that.
Yeah, so I think for reopening, safety and equity and access to a high quality education is paramount. And we will continue to lean on the guidance from DC Health around how do we safely have in-person instruction, which includes having protective equipment readily available to staff and students. We expect that there will be required use of masks. We expect that there will be appropriate social and physical distancing, and then procedures will be modified to ensure that there's minimal interaction where cohorts of students may have cross interactions throughout the day. DC Health has reminded and reiterated on many occasions that it's critical to do contact tracing should there be any infections, and it's important that we continue to have students in cohorts throughout the day in order to accomplish that. And then we're also rethinking arrival, dismissal, use of restrooms, water stations, and how students will get water throughout the day. And then lunch would likely be served in classrooms. And again, we would also minimize any transition of students throughout the day. We also understand that the ability to provide in-person instruction to respond to the demand for that would heavily hinge on our teacher capacity to do so. And we're currently working with our staff to better understand that landscape and our capacity to serve. Finally, I didn't get an opportunity to mention earlier, we're also really excited about the work that you're doing around the social studies curriculum. We believe that this is a critical time to ensure that we are reflecting a very broad and accurate picture of history in our nation, especially as it relates to race in America. So we would love to continue to be very engaged in those conversations and ensure that our thoughts and principles are reflected in whatever is developed for our people.
Great. And I know we're all very pleased, especially Jessica Sutter, our chair, to hear about your interest in the social studies. And I know Scott Abbott is on the advisory committee, so we're all looking very forward to working with him. All right, with that, I'm going to turn it over to John Paul to call on people.
Thank you, Madam President. Chancellor, just so that you're aware too of the method that we're going to use, we're going to use 2 rounds of questions from members, 2 minutes per round per member. There will be a small clock in the bottom right of your screen that shows you the elapsed time. At 30 seconds, I will insert a shared graphic that counts down the last 30 seconds. And I will have to start cutting people off fairly quickly so that we can make sure that every board member has an opportunity to get questions asked in the time that we have. If members are very well aware now of the raise your hand feature, please do use that if you can. If not, feel free to send me a text and I will add you to the list. We can begin today with Mr. O'Sullivan.
Thank you. Thank you for being here, Chancellor Farabee, and thank you for the work you're doing to safely reopen our schools. My name is Alex O'Sullivan. I'm a student representative on the state board, and although I myself am not a DCPS student, I am a rising junior at Base DC Public Charter High School. It is likely that my school may follow some of the same procedures as DCPS and look to you all as a guide and example for reopening. So with that being said, the decisions that your office and DCPS make will likely affect how I experience school in the fall. I, as a student and as someone who cares for the well-being of every person in our city, recognize that this is an extremely difficult issue to manage, and the cost of losing any more school time is being weighed against the potential health risks and safety concerns of students physically learning in school buildings amongst their peers, teachers, and school staff. But I will try to emphasize as much as I can that the health and well-being of every single person in this city is the most important factor. Any policy decision made by elected and appointed officials, and this situation is no different. With that being said, will we be able to receive a written comprehensive plan for how students, teachers, and school staff will be as safe as possible from contracting the virus inside the school and traveling to and from the school building, especially on matters like transportation, universal testing, and under what conditions schools may shut back down?
Yeah, so I hope you're having a great summer, Alex, and it's good to meet you, and I appreciate your questions about safe reopening. As you've highlighted, safety and health of our students and staff is paramount, and we'll continue to provide guidance as we continue to learn more about infections in the district, and also the science around how to best protect our students and staff. What we do know is that strict social distancing protocols have been effective in minimizing the spread of COVID-19. We also know that the wearing of masks has also been documented as a successful strategy to minimize infection as well, along with surface cleaning. And those will all be a part of strategies that DCPS will employ to protect our students and staff. We also know that it's important that we maximize in-person learning time. And so we are thinking through schedules that will both provide safe and academic supportive environments and also promote social emotional well-being. We also know that equity is important. We know that the pandemic has fallen unequally on different communities, and so we must prioritize students furthest from opportunity. We also heard from our families that they want greater consistency, and so we're also thinking about our daily in-person touch points and any learning that would occur virtually to ensure that as much as consistency as possible for families. As relates to and from school, DCPS has had multiple conversations. We'll continue that conversation with public transit and WMATA to ensure that there are appropriate protocols for students to get to and from school. And then we will work with each school community on any safe passage or efforts to protect students as they're walking to and from school. And then school communities will also be supported with any ride share or any other supports that families would like to have as it relates to networking between families to help get students safely to and from school.
Thank you very much, Chancellor. And I do want to note Representative Jacobson yielded his time for the rest of the response so we could get it all in, and I appreciate that as well. Dr. Sutter.
My apologies, Mr. Hayworth. I am on a family vacation and was bidding my parents adieu as they leave. Thanks for the time. Dr. Farabee, thank you so much for joining us this evening. My question has to do with the Washington Teachers Union's response to the teacher request that DCPS sent out yesterday. I read the email that asked teachers to acknowledge whether they're going to return in person or if they plan to take leave under any of the number of legal protections they're enabled to. This seems to have provoked a pretty upset response from both the WTU and a number of my constituents in Ward 6. And I'd just like to ask you to explain to us what the ask is of teachers to return this response by July 10th, and how you plan to respond to teachers who find the request concerning.
Yeah, it was disappointing that, the response from some was, a response of concern. Because the response that we were giving was to be in some ways, responsive to the survey results that we received from teachers. And so we asked our educators to share with us their current thinking around opening school and in-person instruction. And about half of the teachers indicated that they were prepared and ready to serve in person. About another 30% said at that point that they were undecided, and about 20% said that they were not comfortable at that point. To be responsive to those results, we thought it would be very important to then start to help staff think through how they would administer any type of leave or begin to process any documentation for those that were experiencing or have underlying health challenges or are not comfortable coming to work in person. And we wanted to ensure that we put those guidance out to staff sooner versus later. And we believe it's important that we start that process of planning as early as possible, because we don't want to be in a situation where we're thinking through staffing in late July and August, and we know school is starting August 31st. So it was well intended, but I think there is, this chicken and egg, if you will. I think the response of WTU is, show us more safety stuff, and that's fine. We'll continue to share our protocols, and we gave some guidance. But at the same time, we don't want to wait till the last minute also to understand the intentions of our staff. And so this was an intent for us to gather that information so we can plan accordingly.
Thank you, Chancellor.
Ms. McClay.
Chancellor Farabee, thank you very much for taking time tonight to speak with us. I really appreciated your comments, especially talking about the hybrid option. I know I have heard from many parents who are requesting in-person instruction this coming fall. And as you may know, the American Academy of Pediatricians, the AAP, even came out in defense of in-person instruction last week. But I want to focus my question to you today on some of the special populations in our city. You talked a little bit about the special ed population, but I would love to talk about another group that has specific needs, and that is our CTE students. I've heard from actually a number of them. They would like to have more information, and I would love to know your thoughts about what CTE programs and reframing in-person instruction will look like in the fall and moving forward, especially for students who need hours, apprenticeships, and other programs like that.
Yeah, thank you. And then career and technical education is really important, particularly what we know about the labor market and how it evolves, and preparing students to go directly to work right out of high school if they choose to do so. And for many of our students who are desiring to go to higher ed, we know when they have CTE courses in their high school experience, they're better prepared for that journey as well. So what we've done for the summer is we have partnered with the Marion Barry Summer Youth Employment Program to ensure that we have a robust options for students for internships and apprenticeships. Most of them are done virtually, but there are a few in-person options. As we continue to learn more about what's possible for in-person, the hope is to continue to expand more in-person options for students. And most recently this summer, we even had some questions since some barbershops and salons are open, whether or not we could open our cosmetology and barbering programs. And so that is planning that is underway and that we're considering in terms of how we can do that in the safest manner possible. As relates to the opening of the 2021 school year, it is our goal, as I mentioned earlier, to maximize in-person instruction. So it's our hope that for those students that are needing to get hours in or needing to get face time for their certifications, that we can provide as much of that time as possible.
Thank you
very
so much. I appreciate your comments.
Thank
Mr.
you.
Parker.
Thank you, Chancellor Farabee, for joining us tonight. I'm going to focus a bit on instruction, understanding that school is likely going to be a hybrid approach. Can you speak to the supports that are going to be in place for students with disabilities in particular, and what guidance is coming down from central office, as well as instruction generally for all students? We know teachers are going to have to grapple with honor and grade level instruction while addressing the real gaps that probably have been exacerbated given what happened this past spring.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much that is underway and that needs to be done. So I probably won't do this justice, but I'll hit a couple of high points. One is we are doing some curriculum work now. We are paying our teachers to come in, and we're utilizing their expertise to help us revise our curriculum to a hybrid posture. What we heard from our teachers and for some parents is, the DCPS curriculum is great, but it's not designed for learning at home. And there are some ways that it can be tweaked and resources could be adjusted accordingly. And so we're currently in that mode now. We have a bunch of teachers that are helping us with that process. And we anticipate that the curriculum will be very user-friendly in a learning at home posture for the 2021 school year. We're also, as I mentioned earlier, leaning into some of the anti-racist and anti-bias work in our curriculum to identify gaps there as well. And we have some fellows that are reviewing our curriculum. We also had Johns Hopkins University do a curriculum audit for us that was really helpful in identifying areas where we can improve the resources for teachers. Specifically for students that may have IEPs or 504s, we are really focused now on ensuring that any special equipment, any type of technology that can be utilized to maximize in-person instruction or learning at home, that we're able to procure that and provide the best experience for students come the opening of the school year. That includes enhanced protective equipment, especially where students may need closer contact with adults, or there may be students that are not able to communicate with an educator that has a mask, and so ensuring that there's clear masks or protective shields and other assisted technology to support our students that have unique needs. The goal is also to ensure that students that have IEPs or 504s are prioritized for maximum touches in in-person instruction. We know that those students will likely need more time with adults, and we're planning for that. And part of that is in collaboration with OSSI, working through safety measures for transportation, because many of the students that I've referenced that have these unique needs rely on transportation from DC public schools. And so we want to ensure that we're able to provide that in a safe manner.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Dr.
you.
Soy.
Thank you, Dr. Farabee, for being here. And I just want to say how we appreciate how difficult and daunting it must be to be navigating at this moment all of the details and safety issues that you have to manage. So related to that, and sort of building on my colleague Dr. Sutter's question, according to the WTU survey, I believe over 50% of DCPS teachers either reported having a pre-existing condition or living with somebody who does. And so it just seems like that poses quite a difficult situation in terms of planning for the fall. And I'm just wondering if that's something that you've been considering how to manage that.
It is something that we want to manage correctly, and we want to do it with great sensitivity, which is one of the reasons why we provided additional guidance to our educators and staff on what provisions are available to staff who need to care for a loved one in their home or may have a unique pre-existing condition that they need guidance. And so we provided documentation, and this is, again, preliminary documentation of what they should do and what qualifying conditions are supported through current CARES Act, what's supported through FMLA and other ADA leave options. So we can begin to help our employees think through how to keep themselves safe and healthy and care for their families. But most importantly, what we do highlight is we want our educators and staff to consult with their healthcare providers on how they should handle in-person instruction. And we want them to have the best guidance from their healthcare professionals who know the most about their medical history and their risk to COVID.
I guess I'm also just wondering if you know, a large percentage of teachers take leave. Is there a deadline for teachers to report that and a plan for hiring staff?
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, I think that was one of the earlier questions Dr. Sutter asked about, you know, the response from the intent forms that we asked staff to complete. I want to reiterate, you know, how good intention that request is, because as you indicated, it's so important that we understand now what the intentions are of staff so we can adjust accordingly and understand our capacity to serve in-person instruction. We believe that if we're doing that weeks from now, it's going to be extremely late in the game to do that successfully and efficiently. So we hope that people will begin to consult with their healthcare providers now, and we've asked that they give us their intention by July 10th. And we hope to have a better understanding of that landscape after July 10th and can plan accordingly.
Thank you, Chancellor. Dr. O'Leary.
Who'd you say? Me?
You.
Oh, good evening, Chancellor. I have some short questions, and I'd appreciate short answers.
Okay.
What was the daily attendance percentage for students during virtual learning?
So we did not have a structure to accurately assess daily attendance in our learning at home posture. What we do know is about 1% of our student population, we were not able to engage successfully throughout that time period. But 98 to 99% of our students, we were able to engage in some fashion. And some students engage via online learning platforms. Some students engage via phone or learning packets, and there were various modes that students interacted with staff and educators. We have worked really hard on our attendance procedures for 2021 school year, and we anticipate having a much clearer picture of attendance should we be in a hybrid or virtual posture.
Thank you. What percentage of the students did not receive technology?
So we responded to every student who made a request for technology or expressed a need to have support with internet access. We also have continued that access over the summer, and we'll have a similar option for students for the 2021 school year. That included distribution of about 10,000 devices, about 4,000 hotspots to assist with internet access. We did prioritize our secondary students, and so we did start with them. So there could have been a time period in which a high school student had access to a device and we had not gotten to distribution for middle grades or elementary. But however, over the course of the learning at home posture, we were able to distribute to all levels.
Thank you. What was the difference in the graduation rate this year compared to last year?
So we don't have the graduation data yet for the class of 2020, but based on the current graduate students who walked across the stage virtually, we are looking at numbers that are higher compared to where we were last year this time, but there's still a lot of work to do to scrub and clean the data and ensure that we have all the accurate information to submit to OSCE for the final graduation rate.
Thank you very much. Mr. Batchelor.
Thank you, Mr. Hayworth, and thank you, Chancellor, for joining us. So I wanted to refer to a presentation that we saw before you got here. There was a survey by the DME that indicated that Ward 7 and 8 parents who send their kids to Ward 7 and 8 schools are more likely to opt out of in-person instruction. But obviously, we know that in-person instruction is probably more critical for families left furthest behind. But the risk is also higher given the health implications, as well as some of our students go into buildings where social distancing protocols, because of the physical space or the number of students, just becomes more difficult. Could you walk me through what specific supports you're giving to schools east of the river so that they can be prepared for whatever in-person instruction we're preparing for, to retrofit buildings, to make sure they have the cleaning staff that's necessary to keep the building sanitary, to make sure ventilation systems are upgraded and working so that our students and teachers who go back to those buildings can be kept safe with the knowledge of that exponentially higher risk for Black and Brown students east of the river?
Yeah, so what's fascinating around the parent response from the students in Ward 7 and 8 in their school communities is that there was an indication that families were less likely to lean towards in-person instruction. However, when we assess our educators, the educators of schools in Ward 7 and 8 had a larger percent of educators that were wanting and prepared to come in and do in-person instruction. So I share that is because the good news there is we have some indication that there's greater capacity for schools in Ward 7 and 8, which indicates that we would likely have the appropriate staffing to have appropriate ratios for social distancing within the building. But with all of our schools, we will have the appropriate cleaning supplies, disinfecting that will occur. We also will have hand washing stations, sanitizers. We'll have appropriate tools and resources to provide meals to students safely. And we'll have staggered entry and dismissal to keep students safe and the protective equipment that I referenced earlier. And we're currently working with Department of General Services on monitoring our HVAC systems to ensure that they are functioning appropriately to minimize any possible infections. So all of those are in the works, and we, again, will continue to keep safety and the health of our students and staff as the top priority.
Thank you very much, Chancellor. President Wattenberg.
Hi, Chancellor. Again, thank you very much for coming. One point and a couple of questions. I just want to say last month at our public meeting, we had 15 or so people coming to talk to us about their concerns around the reopening. And I think all of us were, I'll just say, taken by how much concern there was and about safety, and how much concern there was that people weren't being heard or solicited for their opinion. And I want you to know that there's many layers between where you are and where teachers are. And I think it's important for you to know that both among teachers and among students, that sense of not being communicated with was very serious and very palpable. One in particular was from a teacher who taught medically fragile students. And part of her point was there's a large set of special issues around those students, and they had not been, as of last week, as of 2 weeks ago, consulted in some serious way, nor had their principals. So I want you to take that home. As everybody has said, we understand the enormous pressures. This is a once in a generation, 2 generation problem. We get that, but I want you to understand how much concern there is out there. That said, let me throw out 2 questions. Let me throw out 2 questions and then you can respond. All right. The one is with regard to the teachers. I believe what part of the issue is, I mean, I think you're right to try to get everything lined up in advance, but I think part of the issue is for that half of teachers who are saying they don't feel comfortable coming in, is there no place for them? I mean, we're going to be in this back and forth hybrid world. Is there no place for them? I think that's part of their question. And then if there's time, I also wanted to ask about how the IEP students were going to be prioritized, because I haven't heard that. Thank you.
Yeah, so we'll go back quickly to your comment about hearing every perspective. 2 weeks ago, we had not had our staff survey launch, and it closed on June 22nd. So that educator now would have had the opportunity to share their feedback. I think what's interesting about feedback is ultimately there will be people that have different opinions on this. And what we're hearing is there are families who are revved up, ready to go, and they can't wait and ready for in-person instruction. And then there's families who are not ready yet and believe that other options, including learning at home, are best for their particular family. And so I think it's important for us to offer both options for families, which is why we have talked previously about hybrid approaches to learning. And we've heard that same perspective from staff, as I mentioned to you earlier. That's we've heard staff members who are ready and prepared to provide in-person instruction, and then those who have concerns about doing so. What would be ideal is the demand for in-person instruction would align perfectly with the teacher interest and capacity to provide that in-person instruction. What we're planning for is the reality is those interests may not align perfectly. And there may be more demand for in-person instruction than intent than we have from our educators. And so I believe that we have a real important and critical responsibility to be responsive to that demand, but do it in a very safe way in protecting our students and protecting also our staff. So that's why we asked our staff to share their intention with us. And again, if we have a demand that's significant, we will have to find ways to be responsive to that demand. And they may be asking some people who have indicated that right now they're not sure, they may not be comfortable, that we need them to be a part of in-person instruction. And if they can't, we need to better understand why they can't, and we giving them some guidance on how to provide appropriate documentation accordingly. As relates to our students that have IEPs, I believe I referenced earlier, and I want to reiterate that we are prioritizing that group of students to try to get as many in-person touches for those students as possible, because we know that many of those students need as much as in-person instruction as possible.
Thank you, Chancellor. I actually missed Ms. Williams from Ward 7 earlier. So Ms. Williams, you have your question.
Chancellor Furby, can you hear me?
Yes.
I hear you.
Thank you for being here this evening. I really appreciate you coming out to answer our questions tonight. If you don't know, I am the State Board representative from east of the river, and a lot of our students do not have the hardware or the computers and things that we were talking about. You said you had 1,100 new devices to be distributed. How many?
11,000.
11,000?
Yes, ma'am.
Great, that's better. But how many of those will be distributed east of the river? And could we have priority on having those devices distributed to the students who need it most?
Yeah, so we always prioritize students who need the most. And as we've done in the spring, we'll continue to do that as we ramp into the 2021 school year. And we work directly through our schools to distribute devices to students. What's interesting though, many of our schools in Ward 7 and 8 already had a hefty amount of technology, and we're able to distribute those devices to families. And we anticipate the ability to do that over the 2021 school year.
Keep those devices.
Excuse me, could you repeat your question?
Those devices, or will they have to turn them back in at some point?
So we've only asked students who are leaving the district to return devices at this point. So even if you are a graduating senior and you need your device over the summer for employment or college prep, we allow students to keep those devices. We allow all other DCPS students who are returning to DCPS to keep their devices. And we've also, for those students that have a DCPS hotspot for internet access, we have paid for service throughout the summer, so students can utilize that for work, or they can utilize it for summer learning, or they can utilize it for enrichment.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chancellor. So noting the time, we are quickly getting, Ruth, did you have comments? Sorry.
I was just going to close out. Is that what you're doing?
Yes.
Well, I mean, we have you till 6:15. Is that right, Chancellor?
You do.
And it's 6:40. Here's what I'm going to say. Thank you so much for coming. We really appreciate it. And I'm going to give you a couple minutes to close if you'd like. And what I just want to see is if we passed on to you a set of very specific questions that we didn't get to, because we really didn't get to our second round. Is that possible?
Yeah, we will try to respond the best possible to any outstanding questions. It's going to offer that as a follow-up to this meeting. But I also want to reiterate that we, as you heard from me, are thinking about a multitude of opportunities for us to get better with our work. I know it's been of interest to this body that we continue to diversify our teacher population. While 16% of the teachers that we hired for this fall are males of color, and even though we have 4 times the national average, we know we still have more work to do. We also know that we need to continue to stay focused on hiring more Latinx educators as well. We have been in contact with the Washington Teachers Union and have been leading a review of impact. And we remain committed to that process, and we'll provide further guidance to our educators on impact. And I know that's also been a topic of interest for this group. And then finally, I know that I got a few questions about the digital divide and digital equity. That please know that we are procuring resources and preparing for the 2021 school year with that in mind, that we know that whether a student is coming in 2 days a week in person and at home the remainder week, or learning from at home 5 days a week, it's critical that they have access to technology and the internet. And we'll continue to be responsive to those needs. And then finally, we are preparing for teaching and learning, but we're also preparing for student wellness. And we have had lots of conversation and development around ensuring that we dive first into the mental health and social emotional well-being of our students. And our schools must be more trauma responsive than ever before, given the current trauma that we know many of our young people are experiencing. And I want everyone on this meeting, this call, to understand that that is a real priority for DCPS, and we're preparing accordingly.
Thank you very much. We appreciate it. And folks, send in questions and we'll pass them on to the Chancellor at the end of this week. So we'll get those to you.
Have a good
And we
evening.
look forward to engaging with you in the future on the projects that you mentioned and other ones we've talked to you about, including well-rounded education, why teachers stay, and so on. So we look forward to it.
Please do. And then let's talk more about the social studies curriculum at the appropriate time.
Great.
Thank you.
Happy summer.
Happy
I know you
summer.
have nothing to do.
Take care.
Bye-bye. Okay. Thank you, everybody. All right. Okay. We're coming back for the discussion about the reopening. That's where we are. So you all should have in your inboxes the memo from Darren outlining a report around reopening. I'm just going to say a couple of things about it and then we'll go into a conversation. The categories are the health concerns, which of course we've just spent a lot of time on, technology, technical difficulties. Do people have devices? How are they going to get fixed? How will fairness and equity around resources be ensured? What role will librarians play? How are students going to be transported safely? What kind of training do parents of children who will be doing the distance learning? I've heard this a lot, I imagine others have. How are policies going to be enforced about social distancing among young children? How is that going to work? What is the role of the staff in that? How will schools, I guess more at the middle and high school level, create the cohorts of students that he talked about, so there's not a lot of mixing? Accommodations for students with special needs, protections for school staff. What about staff that can't find childcare? So I throw those out just to sort of say these are the kinds of things that we'd be looking for. And so what I'm putting on the table is the idea of doing a report that would sort of crosswalk across a number of existing reports and create a space where we'd be able to sort of aggregate what we've heard from testimony and how that compares, so that it would both drive our next round of conversations and be something we could share publicly. A second is if and how we should proceed with some survey work. And a third, and I think I'll also ask Marcus to say a word on this as well, is just the idea that various people have raised, including him, that an important value add of ours is creating the space where people can come and raise the kinds of issues that need to be raised and aren't being raised elsewhere. Marcus, you want to say something about that? Because we talked about that this week.
Sure. No, I think I've probably talked to everybody about it at some point, and I think probably have mentioned it in spaces like this before. Just the importance that this body has in really its ability to convene. I think I've heard that explained in various ways and like for various benefits since I've joined the board. Just our ability to convene and hold conversations about important issues like this. Is a unique space that one, I think the board has leaned into historically, but two, that there's an increased, I think there's an increased narrative around our city that's what makes this body special, is that when folks really want to be heard on issues like our COVID response, like on things like teacher turnover, social studies or that various work, that the state board has been a place where they've been able to come and really have those grievances aired and really and we've been a body that's been able to elevate that into kind of the ethos of the education leadership space. So yeah, I think that is pretty much just the basic philosophy behind that, is saying that, you know, for a lot of these issues, especially around the COVID response, our ability to convene and host those conversations, I think is something we should lean into even more.
And I think that will be part of what we look to do in July. So with that, let me open it up, put your hands up, and John Paul can call in people for comments, input.
Sure. Dr. O'Leary?
Yes, I think that it's important that we have to cut a lot of the fat off of our report and cut to the chase about the things that really matter. As far as things we're talking about, when the chancellor was talking about putting a survey out to find out what teachers were going to come back in the fall, it's July 1st. Nobody has any idea what it's going to look like on July 15th or August 1st or August 15th. And they're talking about opening the schools up on August 31st. What if we're in a worse place then than we are now? There has to be planning for that now. We have to, what bothers me is that we didn't get a lot of questions about it, but like Cardozo is a giant school. It's brand new. It's only been open for 6 or 7 years. It's got enormous amounts of space that could be used for social distancing in the hallways, in the gymnasium, all over the school. And it's all air conditioned, and nothing has been said about the fact that maybe neighborhood schools would be a good idea to open up. The students don't want to get on the bus, and they definitely don't want to get on the metro. And a lot of our students who live in Southeast go to school in Northwest. And I think, and that hasn't even been brought up. So I think we need to talk about, you know, important singular subjects rather than sending out a report that someone might read. We need answers for questions.
Thank you. Ms. McClay, I know you have to leave soon, so.
Can I just, in one quick response to Fraser, in terms of asking for very specific questions and focus, just everybody think about that as well.
Just very quickly, I have to leave in about 5 minutes. Looking at the report, I think if we are going to do this, we should just synthesize what we have received, and also think about the other parents, teachers, and educators who have come to us individually, and we can relay that information without our proposals or suggestions. Fraser has some questions that are not related to education policy, and I don't believe that we, as an education policy body, should be asking those questions, nor do we need to have a response given back to us for those answers.
Thank you.
We should be helpful in as much as we can, but we are an education approval body. We are not the chancellor, and we are not the DME. We are not the mayor, and we need to let these agencies deal with it and not try to control their agencies. And I think oftentimes there are too many people on this board who think we are a school board, and we are not. We can easily relay the information that we have received without trying to jump in where we have not been asked.
Thank you. Mr. O'Sullivan.
Thank you. I just personally, I feel frustrated because, like, as far as what I've been told, we're gonna go back to school in August. For me, it's gonna be a week before August 31st. And right now, like, I've received very little information. And as far as I'm concerned, like, I don't know, like Fraser said, where we're gonna be in August in terms of how many cases there are. I do know there are more cases now than there were when we originally closed schools in March. And I am concerned about my health, about my family's health, about how, if I went back to school, how if anyone went back to school, how that would affect the overall health of the public. And this is like a pandemic. We've never experienced this. First time I lived through something like this in my lifetime. I'm sure for you all it's the same. And I mean, the most important thing is safety. And I mean, this isn't easy for anyone, but I just know that what I've been provided, I don't feel comfortable at all. And I feel like we need more information. This is the most important issue relating to our education right now. I don't know how a student could go to school in fear. That doesn't work. You can't learn, teach in fear. And if that's happening, then it doesn't really matter if all these preventative measures are in place. Because if we don't have testing every day, we don't know if students are asymptomatically spreading the virus. And we don't know a lot about how COVID-19 affects young people, kids especially. There have been preliminary scientific findings, a lot of inconclusive data, but like, this isn't something to mess around with, and we've been given very little. I don't feel comfortable with that, and this is a hard position to be in, but I don't think that this is something where we should just accept somebody's word. We need written, comprehensive plans detailed, like, very finely in every single capacity you can imagine, because this will affect everyone's health. And I think it's important that we as a board do as much as we can, because people's lives are at stake.
Thank you, Alex. Before moving on, I want to say two things. One, Alex, write up those questions that you think need to be in writing so that people feel a sense of safety so that we can pass them on. Two, to everybody, as you are responding, think also of who we should have at our July meeting, or topics, whether it's questions like Fraser said, or individuals.
Thank you. Dr. Sutter.
Thank you. So I've spent the past 4 days with family, 2 of whom are health professionals, having a lot of discussions about this. One is a nurse who is already back in a workplace and working under current virus mitigation protocols. The other is the mother of 2 toddlers who feels deeply the pain and impact that all of this, having the children home all the time, is for a lot of our families and the families we represent. But one of the things that stood out to me in the conversation, these folks, my mother and sister-in-law, live in 2 different states and 2 different places where things are unfolding with very different plans than what we're seeing in DC. My folks live in Howard County, Maryland, where they've made quite clear that their hope is to use all available schooling space under control of the district. So this is not private schools. There are not charter schools in Howard County. So this is just what is under control of the district, to spread out the elementary school students only. They will prioritize middle and high school students with special needs, but otherwise those students will do for full-time virtual education in order to allow for the children who whose families need them to be in childcare, schooling, etc., during the day to be able to do that. I think that a laundry list of questions is less likely to get us the kind of responses that we need than are some targeted questions around things like, what are the various scenario proposals underway, and what data will you need to make a decision on which proposal you will go with? I think as we think about those kinds of things, we also have to prioritize which questions we think hold water. I do know that Empower Ed has been strongly asking folks to consider the notion of outdoor schooling. And I shared with folks in a previous meeting that when I lived in Southern California, that was a very viable option. I do not think, especially given what we learned from teachers last time about medically fragile students, when we think about the schooling conditions a lot of our schools have to deal with. I think about Brent Elementary in Ward 6. Where would we put children to school them outdoors? The school barely has space for playgrounds. So I think that we may not want to prioritize every question just because we got it, but we may have to say, what do we as a state policy body think are the questions that have the highest yield value of us to ask other agencies? So those are my sort of two content pieces. I think it would be very helpful to see if we could get someone from a public health space to come and speak with us about the evolving information that is coming out about children and the virus and what that means for schools. I really appreciated that Ashley pointed out the American Association of Pediatrics is very much in favor of in-person schooling for all of the many factors that go into childhood, the social emotional, the in-person connection, the bonding, et cetera, that happens between adults and children in schools. And the reaction to that from teachers, from parents, was sort of wild. Some folks were like, this is terrible, you don't know anything. Like, well, they're pediatricians, I gotta think maybe they know something. So I do think that everyone is working with information that is evolving constantly, and I would hope that having some health perspective at our meeting might be something that can help us stay informed on the latest data. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Parker.
No comment.
Thank you. Dr. Gasoy.
Thank you. I guess I'm sort of thinking, again, following up on Jessica's comments about the outdoor learning. I want to build on that. I've been trying to think about, first of all, I want to say that this idea of utilizing the high schools for elementary students sounds like an interesting idea to explore. And that's how I've been trying to think. And I would like to, perhaps gather research on what other states are doing in that vein of utilizing space or thinking outside of the box about how we can use untraditional and, really use the spaces that the school spaces we have to greatest capacity. So I'm thinking about also libraries and museums. Could space be set aside in those places? And about outdoor learning, my understanding is it wouldn't be all schools, but that there would be some settings that would be options where it made sense and when it made sense. Obviously, this would not be a year-round situation, but I do think that we have to think beyond sort of what school looks like traditionally, right? And beyond just the distance learning where kids are at home. I'm hearing a lot from parents and not so much from educators, but mostly from parents, just like they're freaking out that with all of these schedules, they want their kids to go back to school full time, but they're also afraid of the safety stuff. So I guess, are there ways that we could have more space and then also partnerships, again, with museums, libraries, places where staff come into contact with children, but aren't necessarily teachers or educators themselves, but may be able to offer students an experience while they're not, attending school in person there 2 days a week, or when they would normally be at home in front of a computer. So those are my thoughts right now.
Thank you. Mr. Parker. Sorry, Mr. Batchelor. You're right at you, Marcus.
No problem. Thanks. Yeah, no, I'll echo all of those sentiments. I think the other thing I'm thinking about, and again, I think I mentioned this previously, was that again, even from my position as the Ward 8 representative, given that over half my young people go to public charter schools and realizing that school communities and our community at large is not a silo, I'm particularly focused around what statewide guidance is coming from DOH by way of them or the DME on guidance across the state on general safety protocols for schools across the city. I think with 160 something LEAs, right, there's 160 something chances that this can go wrong and really end badly for so many of our students. And so while we're honing in on DCPS, right, which rightfully so is like the biggest piece of this pie, I think we as a state agency also have the obligation to hone in on what statewide guidance is being provided for all school communities so that there's a standard of safety and care for the students returning to the classroom in whatever form. So just wanted to put that on the table and hope that as we participate in these conversations on an ongoing basis, we really focus in on what standard guidance all of our schools are getting to protect all of our students and families. So that's it for me.
Thank you. President Wattenberg?
A couple little things and maybe a broader one. I just, on the narrow question of the outdoor education, one thing I do want to say about outdoor education, but I think it's broader, which is how to have guidance that is standard and yet recognizes the need for discretion in different places. Because I hear what you're saying about Brent, it doesn't make any sense. I'll tell you where I am, where the schools are so overcrowded, people are talking about, we don't know how we can fit kids in here in a socially distant way if we don't have access to either other buildings, as Emily's describing, or as they have in Howard, or using the outdoors. So part of what I'm sort of thinking about is how to promote more discretion at school levels. So that's a question. And so I'm not sure I'm getting a sense from people that they feel like the report as we're describing it is going to be impactful. So I really would like to hear if people have some more specific ways to do that. The other thing that someone had raised a while ago, and it really goes back to what Sarah's presentation was about, and someone raised this at a meeting, and it struck me, one of you, and I can't remember who, just that as we go into the new year, actually, I think it might have been Zach, that as we go into the new year, what's going on? You know, can we play a role with some constant surveying or some constant communication with some of these groups to sort of get real hard answers to real questions, so that we know, how many devices are out there, or how many kids don't have devices, or we know whether or not, to the conversation today, that there are protocols for medically fragile students. In other words, maybe part of it is to cull what we've been hearing into sort of simple questions, and then we can play a role in sort of assessing it and sort of figuring out a way to survey. So I want to throw that out and then meld that with some testimony, public testimony. So
President Wattenberg, I want to note that Mr. Jacobson also has a comment.
Yeah, and thank you so much. This is a great discussion, and it's important that we talk to each other about this. I think on COVID in particular, we've been really good at listening to anecdotes from people that come before us for public testimony and talking to each other about our opinions. But what I'd really love to see at the July meeting is let's have someone from the Department of Health come and talk to us. Let's have someone from Children's National Medical Center tell us, so that we can tell others, what the actual impact is on a child's body when their lungs shut down, and what this what the long-term implications, at least the short-term, long-term ramifications are for when a child does get sick, because I think it's incumbent upon us to do that. If we want to be a platform, let's be a platform for facts. Opinions are important, absolutely, but let's be a platform for facts on how we can safely reopen, how we can rely on science, and how we can be leaders in this field. I think our constituents would very much appreciate that, and I know I would.
Thank you. President Wattenberg, do we have time for another round? I know Dr. O'Leary has another comment.
I think so. I'm counting on you more than me for the timing, but I think we certainly have time for one more, and I will look at my notes here.
Sure. Dr. O'Leary?
I'm not going to be long at all. I just think that it's important that we listen. I agree with everybody about the medical people, but we also need to have people from the systems in the city, the school system, to let us know what they're doing, because we can't get information about anything. And that's what I'd like to hear. I mean, if it's from the large, like from KIP or from the large charter programs, or somebody in DCPS knows what's going on. And we just need to know, because we're supposed to be representing the students and parents and teachers of the city. And we don't know what's going to be going on in July as far as things. And there's got to be something going on.
Thank you. Is there additional comment?
Anybody have other specific recommendations for the July meeting? We have the recommendations from Jack, and I think somebody else about the medical expertise, which I would say also runs a gamut based on what I see. So it's not just one thing, but it's to hear the continuum on that. And then I think it would be very interesting to hear maybe from these folks, from someone from Howard County, because I think that's I think that's really a very fascinating and interesting way to think about it. And it's not going to happen in September. I get that people are already far along the way, but to maybe be posing some ideas that could be picked up subsequently may be worth doing.
I would just add to that, yes, that and anyone else, any other states or districts that are doing interesting work. Since we're doing it virtually, it really opens it up, right? So
it's true. Yeah. All right. Okay. Sounds like we're good on that. I mean, what can I just ask? Can I just get a sense of people either from hands or smiles or thumbs or whatever, or call me later? This idea of doing some regular surveying, some regular assessment to try to get a handle on what's happening, that can be a place for us. I see one thumb up, one thumb down.
I don't think surveys are the answer to what we need to find out. I think that we need to have some people that know what they're doing to tell us what's going on.
Yeah, I agree. We just heard a summary of surveys.
I'm sorry, Jack, you talk.
Well, we just heard a summary of surveys, and a lot of people are doing surveys. I don't think that that is our best use of resources. I agree with Rachel.
And Ruth, I would just add the idea that I had mentioned was less about surveying schools and more so elevating instructional best practices in a COVID context. So what does hybrid learning look like? What does it look like to improve learning virtually or in person? And I think instead of us surveying, we can identify those best practices and put it out there to the district.
Okay, I'm not hearing a lot of interest in going forward on that, so point taken. I will say, though, to Fraser's point, unfortunately, the people who know what's going on, if they do know what's going on, aren't coming to tell us. So the question is sort of, how are we going to find out apart from our ability to talk to our own people in our own wards, and do we want to do something broader? So I just throw that out there, but we're not going to pursue it at this point, because I don't feel like
we need to get those people in here. If the chancellor came, all right, and if why won't they come and tell us what they're doing? the people wonder what's going on with the schools. I think we need to get the questions out there to get people to come and testify or just tell what's going on with the schools. I mean, they talk about all these generalities about cleaning up the schools and stuff like that. They're not cleaning up the schools right now. And you know, how are the schools getting ready for your child? For me, that's the bottom line. All right. My children have been with me for 3 months. But you know, they're adults. They've been with me for 3 months. They don't want to go outside. They don't want to be around people because they're scared of this unknown disease that's killing people, thousands and thousands of people every day. And what is the system doing about it? Alex doesn't want to go back to school.
Right.
Alex is the perfect representative for all the children in this city. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. Alex.
No, I mean, I agree with you, and I'm not sure how to resolve it. So keep raising it. We can also talk offline and see if there's a way to turn that into something very specific, because I'm not sure how to. Okay, Alex, and then
Wait, I'm sorry, President Weinberg. So Karen had a question earlier.
Oh, I'm sorry, Karen, I don't see your, okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. The thing we're arguing about how to tackle this, the issue that we're ignoring is that we don't know, because we don't know what's going to happen. We don't have the information to disseminate hard questions like what Fraser was saying. Is not there. And I understand Alex's and my and everybody else's fears because we don't know what's happening. And while this is something we would like to know, at this point, the information is not there to share. And so we need to learn a way to support each other through this and stop arguing about it. Okay? Thank you.
Mr. O'Sullivan?
Yeah, aren't we the only like elected education like group, what a position in the city? I mean, everyone else who's making these decisions is either the mayor or appointed by the mayor. And like our job is to represent the people who I guess elected you guys and put you all in the positions that you have now. And I mean, we're supposed to go back to school. I'm supposed to go back to school. Teachers are supposed to go back to school. And we've been told next to nothing. And in no situation, like the NBA is supposed to start in Orlando in like a bubble. And they've had more information about what's going to be happening there for something that doesn't matter as much. Like, their job is to entertain. Our job is the most important thing that happens in society, probably education. And we've been told almost no information. And that isn't okay. And I mean, I just don't think that we should take no for an answer. I know that I wasn't satisfied with the chancellor's answers, and he seemed to say a lot of general things about talking to people and how we're generally doing a lot of health things in schools, keep people safe. But until there's something specific written down on paper that says, okay, in which schools is this happening? Where are we going to go to schools? Where are we going to effectively socially distance? How will it happen? How will we keep people safe outside of school? I don't understand how we can just take what we've been given now and think it's okay. Because if someone dies, it's on us. It's on every person who had the power to influence what happens. And right now, we've been given nothing. And the WTU yesterday was pretty frustrated about what happened. And we got a chance to talk to the chancellor, and not a lot of people have gotten to talk directly to these people who are making the decisions. And it's not fair to anyone how much information they've been provided. And we need more information, and we need specific information, and we need answers to all the questions that we have. And that's the most important thing. So, I mean, I just think before we do anything about asking students, teachers, they feel comfortable, we need to understand and totally understand what exactly DCPS, PCBS is doing to keep us safe.
Thank you. Sorry, yes.
I know that Jack had his hand up. Do you want to go one more time, Jack?
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you. And Alex, as always, I couldn't agree with you more. That's exactly where we are. But I just make sure that we are asking people to come before us and not just saying no one is coming and telling us anything. We specifically need to say to the deputy mayor, we would like someone from your team to come down and talk to us about X, Y, and Z at our meeting in July. There's been a lot of, I hesitate to say this, but there's been a lot of consternation on this board and among us that we weren't on the reopen committee. But we never asked to be on that committee. We just complained that we weren't on it. Every single time we've gotten into something frustrating or something really difficult over the past 8 years, the president, not staff, has taken the initiative to talk to the chancellor, the deputy mayor, the mayor, the council member, the committee chair, you name it, the superintendent certainly. I'd encourage you to just go ahead, Ruth and Marcus, and call these folks and ask them to come down. You're the president and vice president of the board. They should take your calls, and we should just ask specifically for the deputy mayor, the superintendent, and maybe a representative from the public charter school board. Tell us what the plans are and what happens when somebody gets sick and what happens about transportation so that students can get to and from school. What happens if we don't have enough teachers to fill our schools? Are we then not enforcing teacher certification? There are a ton of questions here, but I think just a direct request from our leadership team would be helpful.
Thank you, Jack. I will say we did make a big point about not being consulted around the regs, and everybody wasn't necessarily thrilled with that. So we certainly did raise in some quarters, I know with the council, that we were concerned about not being on reopen. So we're trying to do it in the way that makes sense, but I certainly agree with you that we should be inviting these people to speak. We have the chancellor tonight, and I think it's a good idea to invite someone from the deputy mayor's office. I think to Alex's point, it doesn't necessarily result in specific answers. It doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. We should, and we should come with specific questions, but.
And let me also just say that there's also already been a direct ask from the DME that we made for June's meeting to come and update us on reopen plans. And so we'll follow up on that request since they weren't able to make it, but those specific requests have been made.
Dr. Sutter? Dr. Sutter, you're on mute.
Thank you. The one thing I would add is that I understand everything we're saying, and I do think that we need to invite people to speak to us directly and give us information that we can disseminate so that we're both receiving questions from stakeholders and constituents, but also receiving answers and information we can share back with folks. I think we also have to offer grace in ways that may feel uncomfortable for a body of people that is used to sort of agitating on behalf of constituents, because we've been at this now since March, and what we learn about this disease changes by the day. The guidance changes by the week. States that reopened are beginning to shut down. States that were congratulated for incredible decreases in their numbers are seeing incredible jumps. And sometimes because of actions that are clearly linked, like, oh, you reopened bars. Well, look what happened. Other states, not so much. You're seeing a rise in states like New York. And I think there's a lot of question as to exactly what is happening in a state that has been so badly affected by this. So what I don't want us to do is say, we need answers to questions that we know are unanswerable. I want us to ask for answers to questions that we should have had answered. And I do hope that we ask leadership to be transparent about at least the options under consideration and the various factors that will lead them to choose option A over option B or option C instead of either A or B. But I don't think we can expect people to come to us with certainty in an environment that is so uncertain. And I say this as a total control freak who is doing an awful lot of daily meditation and deep breathing to get through this. But I think we have to acknowledge that our public officials too are working with the same information that we are, and that the general public is seeing change day to day.
All right. Thank you, Marcus, you have one more thing?
No. I just wanted to say, I think that's important. And the hope would have been that, right, given that, right, there was a whole group that did give, right, very specific guidance, right, step-by-step guidance that we're following right now about those eventualities, about, right, how we gather as groups, how we open bars and restaurants, how we do all of those things, right? We're following different guidelines based on the evolving eventualities, and we just haven't done that with our schools, which I think we could, right? And so I think to Alex's point, right, it is on us, right, to agitate, and to Jessica's point, insofar as like we're asking for very specific things that we should have gotten already. And while I understand that the situation does evolve, there are, I think, questions that our constituents ask, and quite frankly, questions we've asked in the past and tonight that we should already have answers to, that we just don't. And so I do want to make sure that for sure we're honing in on those things that we should know right now. And I think the questions left on the table that should be answered at this stage, especially as we're asking, right, teachers to consider their employment options, right, over the next couple of weeks, some of those questions should just be answered at this point.
All right. We are going to move on. There is, I think, next on your agenda, it says the statewide accountability plan. We're actually going to switch that with the equity framework. So the equity framework is going to come first, because we also think in a conversation with Zach that it helps us set a stage for the discussion about the accountability plan. So with that, Mr. Parker, I'm turning it over to you for the equity framework discussion.
Great. Thanks. John Paul, maybe I should have did this before, but oh wait. I'm trying to share my screen. Can you just confirm if I'm sharing my screen? Not yet?
You're not.
Am I now?
Yes. Well, yes.
Yes. Okay. I'm going to set my timer. I'm going to try and stick to the 15 minutes because I know there's a lot on the agenda. It is set. Well, before I'm going to pause it. I'm going to go through a very quick frame that I would like to provide to help orient you all to the discussion. We're going to then discuss the process very briefly, and then discuss the revisions to the equity statement, and then where things are with the framework. So we're going to jump in now. So as you recall in our previous discussions, here's our multi-year equity vision proposal. Obviously, we're in this first phase of refining our equity statement and building out a framework with the hope that in the coming years, we will identify equity gaps that persist across the district, as well as working with stakeholders to build an equity plan. This has been revised based on some of the feedback that I've received. And here's our general process. And so at our last June working session, I introduced the equity statement revisions as well as a proposal for the framework. And this is just detailing how, leading up to our September board meeting, we will work and engage. The areas that I revised are these areas highlighted in red. And understanding everything that's going on related to COVID, especially, what I heard loud and clear is it's really hard to get stakeholder or constituent and school leader feedback on this. And some of you even pushed me on whether that was even the right call. Just to let you know, my thinking was that the state board is in a function, the people's board, and so that folks would want to be a part of this process, but I heard you loud and clear. So the next phase, you'll notice we've cut out the feedback loop with constituents and educators. If you want to engage external constituents, you can totally do that, but that's not going to be one of the expectations. In terms of a frame, and this should be familiar to Jessica, who I believe is reading Singleton's book around the 4 agreements for courageous conversations. in there, he highlights these areas, and I'm just paraphrasing here, that I'm hoping we can stay engaged, that as we speak, we do so with mercy, but we also speak our truth, that we lean in and experience discomfort, and that we realize that this conversation, as well as the work that we're going to engage in over the coming months and years, we're not going to reach closure. In other words, this work of equity is ongoing and ever evolving. So that's one frame that I want you to hold. And then the second one, which is pretty important, I would suggest, is this idea of the lenses that we view the world through. And so here are four of the lenses that are, or three of the lenses that are adapted from Mark Alexander's work and book, which are the simulations lens, colorblind lens, and meritocratic lens. And then I added this anti-racist lens. And you can see in parentheses the blurb that describes what this lens might ascribe to in terms of how one might orient to see the world. So I'm not going to read through all of this, but the assimilationist lens in terms of education is one who is seeing that our students should fit in, incorporate themselves, and be embedded into this general education philosophy in order to get along and excel. This colorblind lens tends not to value, speak to, or honor race and how they're viewing the world or education issues. And so you may hear someone say, oh, I don't see color. I've had recent conversations with some colleagues where these folk might overemphasize socioeconomic aspects while deprioritizing the way in which race influences perceptions and how things play out in our schools. This meritocratic lens, I'm sure we're all familiar with. If only a student were to work hard, if only communities worked harder, they would do better. This idea of, and there are typos, but there's idea that the harder students work, the better off they are. And I'm framing here to just say that this framework and the revisions to our equity statement is in this idea that we're moving towards an anti-racist lens. And so Dr. Kendi, who I'm sure many of you are familiar with, has coined this phrase in many ways and suggests that it is not enough to be neutral, or it is not enough to keep our head down in the sand in order for us to achieve the educational outcomes that we want. And he would argue outcomes generally in America, that we have to be intentional in pushing back on those systems. And so I just wanted to orient here because I know different folk may come at this work with different lenses, and I'm gonna pause there. No, actually, I'm gonna keep going for the sake of time, but open it up later for questions in case anyone wants to dig in more. Headline here, this is anchored in an anti-racist lens in case people are having any tensions and just trying to understand where we're coming from. Very quickly, why are we updating the State Board's equity statement? It is to make it more practical and relevant to the realities our students are facing, and it builds on the work that has already been done. So this is not the first time we've talked about this. There has been an effort to emphasize and keep central equity in our work for many years. And so this is just building on to that. As we look at the revisions, which I'm about to highlight, and I know it's going to be a lot of words on the screen, I would just like you to think about what is affirming about the revisions that you see to the equity statement and what still needs work. We're not going to iron them all out here. That work is going to be offline, but at least we can engage in some brief discussion after I go through the entire thing. So here are the revisions. I tried to honor what I heard from everyone. John Paul, I'm not sure, should we read this or can everyone see this? Is it too small? I'm not sure.
I believe everyone can see it, but if you want to do it in slideshow presentation, it might make it larger for everybody.
Yep. Okay, so I'll give everyone 1 minute for the sake of time just to read through this.
During that time, Zachary, can you send me a copy of this presentation?
Yes. Do you mind if I send it after this?
Yeah, that's fine. That's
Yeah.
fine.
Okay. Okay, that's been about 1 minute. I am going to read this just because some people may be calling in, as well as I know people process differently. So bear with me. The revised equity statement, and again, this is still in draft form. The DC State Board of Education believes all students deserve access to high quality instruction and necessary supports in order to meet their full potential according to a range of academic and 21st century learning standards. More importantly, the State Board believes all children with the right supports can achieve at high levels and become well rounded, competent individuals who are engaged in their communities, which we see as the primary objective of PK through 12 education. The State Board acknowledges that racist policies of the past and present, nationally and locally, have contributed to uneven outcomes for various student groups, namely Black and Brown students. Such policies include, but are not limited to, redlining and housing segregation, school segregation, inequitable school funding practices, and biased instructional or curricular choices. To ensure the success of every DC public school student and the reduction of disparities between students, the State Board will advance these aforementioned principles and beliefs through an equity framework focused on 1, improving outcomes for disadvantaged student groups through high quality instruction and necessary social emotional supports. 2, advocating for and ensuring increased representation of historically marginalized groups in DC schools and through the functions of the board. And 3, advocating for and ensuring DC educators and team members have increased access to culturally relevant and anti-racist professional development opportunities. The State Board will identify priority issues aligned to the State Board's equity framework that disproportionately hurts and hinders the educational experience of vulnerable students, use our platform to generate public attention and a public policy focus on these issues and their solutions, promote and support state education policies under our purview that address these needs, including those embedded in the SSSTAR framework and DC school report cards, and promote transparency that allows the State Board and others to ensure that schools adhere to state policies. I know that is a lot. For the sake of time, I'm gonna, before pausing for a reaction, I'm gonna keep us moving and then everyone can respond together. I just would call out that this first paragraph lays out pretty direct beliefs. The second paragraph lays out pretty direct understanding of the contributions of racism and the impact that it has on our schools currently. This third paragraph lays out the purpose of the equity framework and what we're hoping part of its function is. And then this last paragraph lays out the actions that the board is going to take, the 4 actions that the board is going to take to advance these beliefs and principles. All right. So I'm going to give a quick scenario. And this is in part connected to something that really happened. So a panelist complains about DC school report card because the most important input, the students, determine school outputs. Put differently, the panelists suggest we should never expect some students, for instance, Black or Brown or low-income students, to perform the same as white or high-income students. Does this statement or view align with the State Board's equity statement? Why or why not? For the sake of time, I was meaning for this to be a discussion, but I will reveal it that it does not reflect the board's stance, in part because if you go back to the statement, we boldly say that we believe all children with the right supports can achieve at high levels and become well-rounded, competent individuals, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That may seem minor, but I think it's pretty important for us to put a stake in the ground in terms of what we believe and advance policies, recommendations, resolutions to back up those beliefs. I had a pop quiz here planned, but I'm going to keep it moving for the sake of time. John Paul, you will be proud of me. We have roughly 3 minutes and 20 seconds to go, so I'm going to try and make good on time. And Madam President, if we could maybe borrow 5 more minutes for discussion, I would greatly appreciate it. So
I've got a question, Zach.
wait 1 second, Frazier. Or let me ask, is it okay if we hold off on questions to the end, or is it going to impact your understanding unless you get it answered now?
I thought we were going to talk about the whole statement.
Yep, we're going to talk about, there's one other part, the framework, and then we're going to talk about everything.
Okay.
Just because I know discussion sometimes can run on, and so I want to make sure we get through everything. And if we need to cut the discussion, we could do so without cutting the presentation. Thanks, Frazier, for understanding. The second part is the framework. And so why are we doing that? It is to provide us and constituents a common vocabulary, and us an opportunity and a way of evaluating and filtering policies, programs, proposals, and the decisions that we might make. As we are going to look at the framework design, I would just ask you to keep in mind, like, how might this type of framework help shape your thinking of various initiatives that we're entertaining? One thing I would just highlight here, I really appreciated this graphic, which comes from 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, because if you could see in the larger circle, there are a lot of equity concerns out there. There are a lot of things that we can be concerned about. And the middle circle reflects our area of influence, which I'm one to believe that we have a lot of influence. In part, the role of this equity framework is to get us in that gray circle, which is what are we committing to work on and focus on, so we're not all over the place, constantly just chasing the tail, if you will, whatever the latest, hottest topic is. But in fact, we're advancing coherently equity issues that we believe in. So here is the latest draft based on your feedback. I'm going to quickly orient, and I'll give you a second to review. On the left-hand side, you'll notice that the framework has 3 focus areas. We've changed the language from academic achievement and growth to student outcomes, in part because feedback was received that we should reflect both achievement but also socio-emotional components, which I agreed with. The second focus area has stayed the same. The third has stayed the same. You'll see the descriptions in the middle under guidance of what these focus areas might represent, as well as questions you may ask yourself as you're entertaining a policy, either proposing it or voting on a policy that we may entertain. So I'm going to give us, for the sake of time, 20 seconds here to just review this framework, and then I'm going to wrap up. So I'm going to ask for grace. I know that's probably not a ton of time. I'm asking you to do a lot of reading. But I would just say for student outcomes, the focus here is specifically on disadvantaged student groups. Part of the work that we are going to need to do between now and next month is getting really granular and concrete around some of these terms. So when we say disadvantaged students, who are we actually talking about? Things like that. The second category around representation is broadly connected to historically marginalized groups. Again, when we say that, we need to get clear on who are we thinking about and how we want to increase their representation in schools and through the board's functions. We've had conversations recently about ensuring that we have more teachers of color. I would argue that that would fall under this focus area. And then lastly, ensuring that educators, but also team members and board members are having access to culturally relevant and anti-racist professional development opportunities. The point here is that this takes work, and none of and knowing that none of us are there, we need to continue to develop our skills, each of us. So I think this is the last slide. This is just saying, like, how might we use this framework? So for instance, let's say we're thinking about our agenda for next year, and we want to continue on with teacher retention, hat tip to Frazier. We may, in considering our framework, tailor it to say we want to emphasize how we might work to retain teachers of color, for instance, or as we're thinking about budgeting for next year, maybe we want to carve out some additional space at the next board retreat so that we can collectively do some training around anti-racism or what culturally relevant instruction could look like. So that, and I think that is it. So I'm going to come back now, and hopefully this works. I'm not sure how to stop sharing my screen. Oh, there it is. Okay. So I know that was a lot. The last thing I would just say here, two things I would say. One is the equity statement, again, already existed, and we're entertaining revisions to make what I would argue, make the equity statement more precise and practical in how we use it and orient around it. The equity framework is a new idea. Although we've been doing it in different ways, board members have been pushing these conversations. The hope there is that this new tool will provide us a common vocabulary and way around orienting our work so that it's not just a one-off request from a board member or push, but it's something that we do continuously. So with that, Madam President, if you would lend 5 minutes, 7 minutes, 10 minutes, I don't know how much time we have. I will open it up for reactions, questions, thoughts, also understanding that we're not going to get through everything here and that I'm going to work with Emily to try to take some of this to the Well-Rounded Education Committee, but also will send further guidance around feedback process between now and our next working session.
So let me say what you've taken is all the time allotted to you. However, I just checked in with Emily while you were talking, and I think there does not need to be a WRE report tonight, so we can give you that 10 minutes. And so you guys have 10 minutes. And Fraser, I was trying to find out whether you have a committee report and how long it will be. So if you just text me or chat or say so if it's quick, but Zach, you've now got 10.
Fraser, do you?
Alex has got a report.
Okay. Fraser, do you want to ask your question of Mr. Parker?
And I'm also sending out the presentation.
Yes, if he could put the equity statement back up on.
Yep, here it comes.
And you have to apologize. I won't apologize for being an English teacher, but I think that the second paragraph needs to be deleted. I think takes all the power out of the statement. And especially when you get to the third paragraph where it says to ensure the success of every blah, 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 second line, advance these aforementioned principles and beliefs. The aforementioned principles and beliefs are in the first paragraph. And then you've got this second paragraph that really doesn't have anything to do with what we're doing. Talks about the history of it and everything, but it takes all the power away from what the first paragraph says. And the third paragraph is very powerful about this is what we're doing because of that's why we're doing it. But the historical information in the second paragraph, to me, really dilutes the argument, or it maybe not dilutes it, but it repurposes the argument. It takes away from what you're saying in the first paragraph. And when you get to the third paragraph, you're starting to think about all the bad things that happen, and you're not thinking about what the good things are in the first paragraph. That's the end of my statement.
Okay.
You know what I mean?
No, I hear you. I think I
don't think we need to say that. I think that's just, it's a reality, but it doesn't really, it's going backwards instead of going forwards.
I hear you. What are other people's reactions or thoughts?
I'm sorry, the second or third paragraph, which one did you say?
Fraser's talking about this paragraph. This is what you're talking about, Fraser, right?
Right. I don't think we need it at all. It flows right in. Without that, you're talking about to ensure the success of blah, 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 the state board will advance these aforementioned principles.
How about,
the aforementioned principles are in the first paragraph.
can I make a suggestion?
Yeah.
That maybe this is footnote. I mean, actually, as I say that, it sounds bad to me. It's not a footnote. It's pretty like, central, but literally a footnote, not figuratively. And it's because of these things, right?
I will say I'm trying to hold off on my reaction. I will just go back to the lenses and think about, and not to say that the language here is perfect. And I know in one of our meetings we were working with the language, but I just would call us back to think about what an anti-racist lens on the statement might call for versus a colorblind lens or a meritocratic lens.
Yeah, I'll just say really quickly, Zach. I think, I'll leave the flow and kind of the style to our English teacher on the board, but I do think that what's the important history, right, outlined in paragraph 2 is also the very important why of why we're doing the equity statement, why we're applying the equity lens to everything we do, and I think, in a world where like we're trying to break away from really like sanitizing, right, the deep impact that racism has had on our systems in a pretty pervasive way in the history, but also currently, I think it's really important for us as a board to say it as plainly as possible. Again, I'm not going to comment on kind of where it goes in the flow, but I think it states very plainly why we're engaging in this work in the first place and why it's so important. So I wouldn't support its exclusion from the statement, but I think it's important, but I don't really have a thought on where it should go. But when I read it, I thought it was in a pretty solid place.
So members, we have a number of people who have their hands up. So please do. I'll call people through the list. I want to note too that I think the second paragraph could actually be stronger if used as a preamble rather than as a second paragraph. That might be another option to keep that, because I think it is really important for us to have a statement like this one, and it might be good as a preamble for the rest of the equity statement. I know that Dr. Sutter has her hand up.
Thanks, John Paul. In Zachary's initial ask of everybody on the board, he'd asked us to reach out to constituents, and I got one constituent who asked very specifically why the state board does not acknowledge in the equity statement that one deeply inequitable practice we have as a city that goes along with this potential preamble paragraph is the fact that schools are assigned by housing. So that your assigned boundary school is a function of your family's ability to afford housing in particular places. And so that was the one piece of feedback I got, is that we talk about housing segregation, and we talk about redlining, but we don't talk about the fact that schools are actually assigned by your address as your in-boundary school of right. And I do think that was profound to me, coming from a Ward 6 constituent where there are many people who are very proud of our in-boundary schools of right. But I think if we are going to take this anti-racist lens, we have to confront the connection between housing values, mortgage prices, and what that affords you in terms of a public school option.
Thank you. I don't see any other hands, but I just know that Fraser, you have another comment. Go ahead.
I had a question, actually. I thought I raised my hand.
Oh, you did. I just wasn't sure since you'd already spoken. I wanted to make sure everyone had the chance to speak.
Oh, sorry.
You're fine.
But I didn't consider that speaking. I was all right. I just am thinking about Dr. Simmons' testimony, and he talked in several ways, different ways, about self-actualization, that schools should offer that, opportunities for that. And I'm wondering if there's a place in the statement and or the framework for making sure students have access to, I don't know, culturally relevant education or something to that effect, that it's not just about academics and social emotional, but also being able to see yourself in the curriculum and to find and pursue your interests and become a full human being.
Yep. I think Dr. Simmons would advocate for that, and I would agree that that is currently missing in the statement. In the framework, we do discuss, oh wait, I think I need to say this. In the framework, we do discuss training for teachers around culturally relevant practices, but not so much that that's what students should be receiving. So that is a good call.
Great. Dr. O'Leary?
I think that I agree that it should be a preamble, but I have a real problem with the last sentence because it's very judgmental and it's talking about things. That first sentence, the state board acknowledges that racist policies of the past and present, nationally and locally, have contributed to uneven outcomes for various student groups, namely Black and Brown students. And then we go into why we have an equity statement. The other stuff is judgmental in a lot of ways. I mean, especially that last part where it says biased instructional or curricular choices. You know, who told you that?
Well, I mean, again, that is why I would respond by saying that is why we as a board need to vote on this. From my seat, I would say I think access to grade level instruction is an equity issue. And so if students of color are being denied that, or students with disabilities are not receiving supports during COVID, and we discussed that tonight, I think the decisions that adults are making day in and day out for children are by extension connected to bias and racist beliefs and practices and policies.
But you say that in the first sentence.
Yes. So I would just recommend, I heard you loud and clear. I would say let's, as we go into the editing process, we could take that offline, but for the sake of this discussion, just keep it high level. Yeah, no, I appreciate it. The push though. According to my clock, John Paul, I have about 1 more minute. So I just will go back here. One of the questions, and I won't name names, but one of the questions that I received is like, well, what's the point of this framework? Like, I get the statement, but what is the framework about? And I know we're going to go into talking about this proposed STAR resolution and maybe the policing resolution. And I just would say that the framework ideally would be something that allows us to operate as tightly as possible in the gray circle here, and identify like what are our focus areas. So we're saying by extension of this framework, these 3 focus areas here are the 3 things that we're putting a stake in the ground that we want to advocate for improving the instruction and social emotional support for disadvantaged student groups to see their outcomes improve. We want to increase the representation of historically marginalized groups in DC schools and through the board's functions. And we want to make sure that educators and team members are having these types of conversations around anti-racism, culturally relevant pedagogy, et cetera. If you all don't agree that those 3 things are the right ones, we could totally tinker with that, but that would be the idea. And so I would just say it would not be far-fetched for me to say or think in the future the board would decide not to pursue certain initiatives because it did not adhere to our equity framework. So I don't know if that clarifies things for people, but it is in a hope that we are able to advance equity, but also filter our work and make it more tailored so that we can be more impactful and operate in this gray circle versus all over the place. So with that, unless there are other questions, John Paul, I cannot see, I'm going to turn it back over, Madam President.
I don't know that we have an additional time for more comments on this right now, but I'll leave that to President Wattenberg to decide.
Okay, thank you.
See anything anymore. Oh, now everybody's back. Nice to see you all. So that's true. We really don't have extra time. I mean, potentially, if we get to the end and people feel like hanging in, maybe people can do that. But otherwise, offline and at our next meeting, I'm trying. I'm always trying to juggle having people participate and trying to get done on time. And I'm not very good at it, but I'm trying. So now we're going to move on to the STAR framework resolution. So let me say a couple of things to start this off. Hopefully, I'm going to set my own timer here. Let me start off with a couple of things and then we can have some discussion. First, as I said in the cover note, just the way the meetings have fallen, given that we changed the date of our working meeting last month, the nice synchronization between having a working meeting and a research committee meeting and so on is out of sync. So this resolution doesn't have the benefit of having been back through the research committee. In other words, we talked about it at a research committee meeting, we talked about it at a working meeting. Now we're talking about it tonight, and it will be talked about again at the research committee meeting this coming week, and then again at the public meeting in July. What I've tried to do, and I know from the comments I clearly haven't done it even close to perfectly, but what I really have tried to do is to reflect to the extent that I can some of what has been coming in and what we've been hearing in our committee meetings from committee members and also from some of the testimony. And part of what, to me, the purpose of putting something down on paper is to start to really tighten up where is the consensus and where isn't it, so that we can start to really figure out where we're together and where the issues are, and maybe where we can find some common ground. So that's what I've tried to do here. As Zach said on the previous thing, it won't resolve. We're not going to resolve everything here. We're going to go back to the committee. We're going to go back to the public meeting, and we'll see where we go. Now, to go back to Zach's framework, what I do like about it is this idea that it does try to focus us on whatever our policy piece is, how, if we fix this, is it going to do better for those students in our city who have been historically disadvantaged? And so that's where I tried to start it. Now I want to walk you through different parts of this, and then we'll throw it open. So what I tried to do is really start with that idea that what we're trying to do here is use this conversation and use this vehicle of the STAR framework to improve education, in particular for those in our city who have been most disproportionately hurt and hindered by educational work in the past. Not well said, but second, what I tried to do based on feedback from the committee in particular was to really try to move up the discussion about purpose. And so really the second two whereases are really an effort to try to say, what is the purpose both of the rating as we understand it, and the purpose of the purpose of the accountability process. And so I note, and this comes, I think, from a number, not various people in the committee, that one thing we want is to make sure that it is accurately identifying those schools that are doing a great job, especially with those students who have traditionally been disadvantaged, so that we can learn from them. A second one is to accurately identify those that are underperforming, so that we can find ways to help them, whether that be resource or technical. And that we have a way, and this is something Zach has pushed a lot, that over time we sort of have in front of us, here's where schools are they making progress? Is this whole effort leading to schools getting the support they need so that they're moving forward? It's to sort of hold everybody accountable. How do we have a framework that does that? So I tried to capture that in the second whereas, and then in the third whereas, tried to capture the purposes that were, and they overlap to some extent, the purposes of the framework as it was stated by Aussie in the beginning, and also to a point Jack has made, is to recognize some of what it has done, including creating uniform information across the sectors and across schools, which is very important. So then what I tried to do is, my sense, and I'm sure the words are not perfect, but my sense from everybody is that over the course of both our committee meetings and the testimony, there is a pretty strong consensus that the way in which the ratings end up working, they do have a biased effect. And by bias, I just mean that they underestimate the quality of schools that have larger numbers of poorer students of color. And that's bias, right? And we don't, and I think we have a consensus on that. What's a lot harder is, how do you solve it? And that, it seems to me, is very much where our conversation is now. We've had very many presentations, and each of us has our own ideas about how do you solve it. And so what I do, so I'll get to that, but I hope that I've captured some of the consensus around the bias issue, and certainly we can make all kinds of wording changes. And then we talk about how the low ratings, whether biased or not, have a hurtful effect on schools, especially where our most struggling students go. That is not a problem for everybody on the committee. I recognize that. It is a problem that has been raised by some people on the committee. Also not an issue for everybody, although I think maybe everybody or almost everybody thinks adding some indicators would be a plus. We may not agree on adding all of them. We may have a question about how many, but I think there was, if not total agreement, substantial agreement on that. And then in number 5, a strong agreement that all of these have trade-offs. That's where the conversation is. How do we put these together? How do we resolve the bias issue? How do we resolve some of these other issues in ways that recognize the different trade-offs? And so then I just lay out sort of what our next package of work would be, to come up with specific ideas around these different problems that we see, and then to the second resolve, really to come back to this idea of, and how do we make sure that these ratings and what we learn from this, when we learn that certain schools aren't achieving as they should, that we have a way of getting the support to them, and we describe that kind of support. For example, maybe every school that has low growth, for example, that part of what we would say is every one of those schools should have access to a quality school review, which is used in the charter sector and also in some other places. And that any school that has a substantial number of, a certain percentage of students with low proficiency, it's a resource question. In other words, low proficiency is a lot about resources. Low growth may be a lot about the technical work going on in the school. So part of it is to sort of think about what could we say, what could we do that would allow this to be more useful than I would say many of us think it is, in terms of delivering the goods, so to speak. So that's really what I want to say. So I guess people can get in. I know Jessica sent a number of questions and comments, so I don't know if you want to go first, Jessica.
I'd be happy to, Ruth. Thanks for walking us through this, and I do appreciate your clarification that the scheduling changes mean that this has not been seen by the research committee, and so it was coming to all of us at once. That is probably a place where I would have been able to work through some of these questions with you all. I think there are 2 big things that I would share for folks who haven't read my comments yet. One is my general sense of whereas statements versus therefore be it resolved statements in our resolutions are that the whereas statements are agreed upon facts on the way things are, and the therefore be it resolved are about actions we want taken. This resolution appears to have some future thinking in the whereas statements, and I worry that creates a perception that some of the things we're putting in the whereas statements are not actually happening now, when some of them are. So for instance, there's a place where you reference sharing promising practices in schools that are seeing growth. I think in here it's referred to as moving the needle, but we can agree that it's growing students. OSSE does do that with their all-star school tours and their all-star school reports. They have made an effort to collect and disseminate best practices. And the way it's talked about in our resolution suggests that it is not happening. And I worry that that happens in a few places. So I've noted that. My second big concern goes to what Zachary just shared with all of us around the equity statement and the lens through which we view this work. There are a lot of statements in here that come from a real place of deficit thinking and deficit beliefs about students. I'm pretty uncomfortable with us, Kate, sort of caching the language of this in the, we say both historical and structural inequities and racism, but then we put this on the backs of Black and brown families. And that is a real problem for me, that this is the way it's cached in our resolution. Because I think we need to frame it as, it is the job of a school to serve every child that walks through their door, however that child arrives. And this would be true for a child of any race, any socioeconomic status, any state of ability or disability. And I think that the language we've got in here suggests that it is all these other things that are the root of the inequities in our schools, rather than also the practices that are happening in schools and the work of schools themselves. So I worry about the deficit language. I worry about the framing. And then the last thing is that some of this does seem to suggest that there are pieces of this that are settled among members of our board that I do not believe are settled yet. So I made the point specifically that I will not vote for a resolution that includes a change to a dashboard. It is a change I do not want to see in our state accountability system. And so it is presented here as though it is an agreed upon piece, that this would be something we want to pursue. And I would not want to vote on something that suggested I would be willing to pursue that, because I would not. So thanks for the time.
Ruth, do you want to use the hand raising again, or you're on mute, Ruth?
It's up to you, John Paul. You're doing the calling, so you can do hand raising or you can look at people's hands, whatever you choose.
Sure. Do others have comments? I know, Marcus, your hand is raised on the thing that's from before. Dr. Gasoy, go ahead.
Thank you, and thank you all, Ruth and everyone on the committee, for all the work on this. I actually also sent in some comments, and as I said in my email, I think it's generally a strong resolution. I did have some questions and points, and then also I'd like to, I don't know, I think that Jessica makes some good points that I'd like to respond to. So my main two thoughts are about in line 20, we mentioned something about, I have written here, do we know if there's a regular evaluation of support and improvement efforts? If not, seems like something there that should go in the recommendations. Okay, so that's about, in the resolution, you talk about that we will keep track of supports and whether or not they are effective. I believe it's something to that effect. And I think, I guess to Jessica's point, that that's something that should probably go in the recommendations, because I don't think that there's regular evaluation right now of that. So that was one thought. But I think it's a really important point, and I think it's a good idea. And then in line 63, number 2, include issue, there's a list of things that, I'm sorry I'm not looking at it, I don't know where it is right now, but wanted to suggest that maybe we want to include, this is a point that Zach had raised, that especially for high schools, a lot of times they are being assessed on, the education that students have gotten in another school. And so I don't know if that's something that we want to include, but it seems like it would fit in that section where we're talking about the ways that assessments might miss the mark on what the actual quality of a school. And then, let's see, in response, so Jessica raised the point of, I don't remember what your point was, but I wrote down support shouldn't just focus on lowest 5%. So you said something that made me think of that we really do want to focus on support. Again, I think Zach raised this several times, that however we land, I think we should emphasize that the outcomes, regardless of outcomes, that schools that need support should get the support that they need. And I was very impressed with Nebraska's. They have an outline, their school assessment tool really focuses on support, and they have this long list of ways the way they frame it is ways that schools can raise their, I forget what they call it, it's not a rating. I believe they do use a dashboard, but that schools can raise their score. And it's a lot of qualitative indicators. So that's something I will find and maybe share in the chat when I'm done. And then I guess, I'm sorry my memory is so bad these days. I don't know, Jessica, you raised a bunch of things I had thoughts on, now I can't remember. So I will stop there, but I'll probably think of it later and come back.
Thank you.
Sorry.
I don't see other hands, but I just want to check. Okay, Mr. Parker? Or
Go ahead.
Dr. Soy, do you want to finish your one?
No, I'll come back after Zach, but I'll write it down so I remember it.
Okay. Mr. Parker.
Yeah, no, in full disclosure, I went back and forth with Ruth. Ruth, I just want to say thanks for the time that I know that has gone into building this resolution. And I think part of like the tension here is that, to what I heard Jessica and Emily name in some parts, we're not fully aligned as a committee, and I don't think as a board, and perhaps we don't need to be, but just trying to connect it back to the equity framework, I would say, what is our goal in revamping our current rating system? And based on that framework, the goal should be to improve outcomes for disadvantaged students. That is, according to our current draft, what we're putting a stake in the ground for. And so my question to you and to anybody would be, how does moving to a dashboard system do that versus another system? So that's one question. That's one question. Two, I would say, I too kind of cringed with some of the language. And Ruth, I shared this with you, but just elevating the whereas statement. I think it's the last statement on the first page where it kind of lists, and Jessica mentioned like deficit language. I think the question we should be asking here is not what at-risk or Black and Brown students are missing, but again, what supports or inputs are needed to ensure that they can meet whatever outcomes that we've stated. And I think going down to this bullet around the therefore statement, which the second one, the board recommends how to more directly connect the rating to school improvement, I would really like the committee and the board to move in that direction, to just really say that if we agree that our students are not the inputs, and I'm not convinced we all agree there, I just want to go on record, I think some of us may think our students are the input, and I would argue that is a fundamentally problematic view, that if you think because of a student's race, ethnicity, or their income level, that therefore dictates their outcome, that's problematic. And we have proof points to counter that. Now, I know with those proof points, many people will try to explain them away. Oh, well, kicks kids out, or whatever the excuse is. But I think we need to get clear there, as well as move more in the direction of supporting our schools and investing in the inputs that we want. So if that's money, if that's time, if those are more mental health supports, whatever those inputs are, I think that's the direction that I think can make this resolution a bit stronger. Last thing I will end on, and I know I've been talking a little bit, I just wanted to share this document. I also shared it with Ruth. I don't even know if it's all that helpful. I'm not sure if you all, hopefully you can open it. I tried to do a quick comparison of two schools, because we keep talking about the bias that is inherent in our evaluation system. And I agree that there is bias, but I have not heard us name what that bias is or how it operates. And so I took a school in Ward 8, a school in Ward 6. I promise you it was completely random. Both schools have 3-star ratings, and you can see how the stats line up. But it could be worth, I don't know, now or in our next committee meeting, just getting real clear on where we see the bias. Because one lens could be, well, these schools have 3-star ratings, and I'm looking at one school in Ward 8 where only a third of students are proficient or have a level 4 or higher. And so the bias is that we're saying that that's a 3-star rating, which I think many people would translate to being a good school. Now, I'm not saying I ascribe to that view, but that could be one way of identifying bias. Or it could be, well, the Ward 8 school is growing differently or at a faster rate, or students are growing more, I should say, than the Ward 6 school, yet they have similar ratings, whereas the Ward 6 school has higher proficiency or absolute performance. So all in summary, I would say we need to get clear on where we think the bias lies in our current rating system. We need to get clear on whether or not we think our students are the critical inputs, or there are other inputs and what those inputs are. And then lastly, we need to move more in the direction of supporting our schools once they have these ratings. I, for one, would be glad to see OSSE build out a support office akin to what they have in Massachusetts, where there's an office devoted to supporting the development of schools once they receive certain ratings from the state. So I'll end there, but those are just some of my views on the resolution and our current work.
Thank you.
Anybody else?
I don't see anyone else with comments.
Okay, I want to make some responses before we move on. So is it my turn? Oh, Mark.
I actually remembered, if that's okay, unless you want to respond directly, but I just had a question actually for Jessica, which was or are you saying about the dashboard that there is nothing that would change your opinion about that? And if so, why? Because I think we have heard from several of our panelists that not necessarily directly talking about a dashboard, but for instance, Dr. Sapavis talked about not what do you call it? Like smushing all of the indicators into one score, right? Or into one. And I think Dr. Simmons really emphasized that focusing on ratings kind of detracts from some of the other aspects of a school that he, for one, as a Black father, really valued more. So, and I think there were definitely others as well. So I guess I'm just wondering what you're basing that particular line in the sand on.
Yeah, happy to share. So one, I think it neglects the history of what we've had in DC prior to the star rating. So the DC Public Charter School Board adopted the tier system in 2013, and DCPS at that time still just displayed data on schools. And it was a refrain from parents in the city that they wanted comparable data between DC public schools and public charter schools, that the charter schools were clearly rolling up their data into some way to say, here's how we, the authorizer of the school, is assessing the quality of this school and communicating this to you, the public. And DCPS had not done that. So that was a key thing that was seen in OSSE's feedback from families and the public on the star rating, that there was a desire from families to have a clear, comparable set of information with a rolled up understanding of what they should take away from the information about how the state assessed the quality of the school. So that's one reason that I am holding my line in the sand on a summative rating of some sort. The second reason is that if we do not do this, if we do not say, we as the state, the folks accountable for the budget of these schools, accountable for the support for schools, accountable for the regulations and expectations for these schools, if we don't say, here's what we assess as quality, others will do so anyway. Great schools will do it. Niche.com will do it. Any other outside entity that parents can go to say, okay, the state did away with my rating. They just put together a dashboard. I can't figure out what the hell I'm supposed to figure out from this. I'm going to instead go to this other system. And we know from existing research on what Great Schools has done that it does not contain the components that our state accountability system does. The state accountability system designed with parent input, with stakeholder input, in a way that the Great Schools rating is not. So I'm always troubled when panelists compare Great Schools and the STAR system, because Great Schools is an independent organization which made this rating that it applies to schools all over the country. Our state accountability system was designed locally with local input from local stakeholders, approved by our State Board of Education, and took into account these pieces of feedback. And so I worry that if we backtrack on that piece of information that did not exist before the STAR rating, when, by the way, parents were still using all sorts of inputs, as parents do now, to decide what to do about sending their child to school, we're going to cede the field to folks who are not our local input, who have not given that system. And I think the last thing I would say, I don't dispute at all what Dr. Simmons said around the fact that, of course, as a parent, you are going to use your judgment on what the data says, what you know of your child, and what you're looking for. Is it a school close to home? Is it a school with a specialty program? Is it a school that is responsive to aspects of your child's personality or their needs? And no single rating could ever encompass that for any parent. So I don't think that a dashboard does for every parent any more than a single rating could do for every parent, because every parent has to take into account both the publicly available data and all the other variables about their child in deciding what to do. So that's how I came to it. I don't dispute that others will think differently, but that's how I've come to where I stand on, I think we need a summative rating.
Can I just ask one more thing? And that was very thorough, so but I guess I'm just curious, the value added that you think, like, what is I understand those points are really important. What does it provide that a dashboard doesn't? That is.
So let me use this example. And again, I spent a whole bunch of time with medical professionals over the past couple of days. So when you go get lab work done, right? If I go get my blood drawn and I get my lab work done, it gives me a value, my value for my blood work. It also gives me the range of acceptable values. So I'm getting both my standard along the expectation. Well, I didn't set the expectation of acceptable values. The medical professionals who know something about this that I do not have said, here's the range of acceptable and here's where you are. I think our school rating system is an effort to say, there are things we know about education, where students should be by a certain grade level, how much growth a child should have in a given year, what we know of the correlation between re-enrollment rates and satisfaction with the programming at a school, and what it tells us about the fact that school is able to retain its students or not. What we know from any other numbers of those ratings. We can't expect parents to know all of that information on their own. Maybe some parents who are educators may have some of that information, but we can't expect the broad spectrum of parents to be able to have that expertise on education. And so I think what we're trying to say is the expertise from the state education agency says, here's the range of acceptable. These are the rating scores that fall into the 5-star, 4-star, 3-star category. Below that, we are not comfortable with what is happening in that school. We say that has fallen outside the range of what we find to be acceptable school quality. I think that's why I've said on here, I feel so strongly that we must absolutely push on these pieces of school supports. What are we doing for schools that fall outside that acceptable range of quality? How are we checking on the continuous improvement and progress? But I am not uncomfortable with, and I would hope that we do not get to a point where we decide we shouldn't draw a line and say, here's the range of acceptable, and here's where schools fall within it.
Okay. I'm going to just respond to a few things and then we're going to move on. So I think that just to the last point that Jessica made, I think nobody here that I know of wants to not say this is what's unacceptable. The question is whether or not, with the way we're doing it, we're naming schools as unacceptable when the school is not unacceptable. That's what we mean by the idea of bias, that a school is being kind of downrated, not because of the quality of the school, but because of other reasons. And I, just as an example of that, you talked about re-enrollment. And one of the things that we have heard from, I think, a couple of different witnesses is whether or not students re-enroll has a lot to do with whether or not families move. And whether or not families move has a lot to do with their housing instability and their homelessness. So that's why, and I use that example because it came up in the testimony, that if you rate the quality of a school based on re-enrollment, part of what you're baking into that rating, it seems like, is you're rating the school based on things that don't have to do with the school quality. So I just want to say that. And I also want to say, this really is to Zach, is I think you said that we haven't really named the biases, although then you gave an example showing the bias. I mean, I actually think we've had a lot of people, maybe I misread it, I believe we've had a lot of people come and talk to us about the different biases, starting with Aaron and with Betsy, who were able to show us in a lot of different ways how schools with high growth, and let me see if I can remember this right, high growth, but also high at risk didn't get as high ratings as schools that were high growth without as many at-risk students, that was a way in which they were kind of unfairly rated. And his point was the result is it's hurtful to the school in different ways. He talked about, you know, the effects that it had on teacher and staff stress. He also talked about the effect that it did have on discouraging people from wanting to be aggressive in recruiting lower scoring schools, students to the schools. So there's real effects. And then the last thing I just want to say, I know I'm just giving sort of one example in each category, I think there's more, but Zach, to your question about how would this help outcomes, and I don't know if you're talking about just the dashboard or everything else, but the way it would help outcomes if we could have a rating system or a way of presenting this that was more accurate about the quality of the school, the way it would help outcomes is that it would allow us to identify for the city, look, these are the schools that are doing a terrific job. I'm thinking growth. They are really moving the needle. Let's celebrate them. Let's really focus on them. And I think a lot of times now, those schools can get lost because the proficiency may be low. So that's one example of how it would help. Another is to the point that you've been making, and I think it's absolutely right, is how do we connect? We need accurate ratings to connect to the right kinds of assistance. For example, and we talked about this, if you have a school that's both low, schools with low proficiencies, students haven't had opportunities and they need a lot more. They need a lot of resources to provide the opportunities that people need. a school that's low proficiency and low growth needs those resources. It also probably needs some intervention about the technical work that it's doing. It's probably not adequate. On the other hand, a school that's low proficiency but has very high growth, I think I'd want to say, man, don't mess with what they're doing. They're doing a good job with what they have. They need the resources so that they can do more of it. Maybe they can have smaller class sizes, or they can have more time, or they can provide tutors, whatever it is. So I think that providing the right assistance depends on having a fair system of rating them. Now, let me just say this. I didn't respond to everything. And look, on the dashboard, if there's not support for it, there's not support for it. I have a lot of reasons. I think it's a good idea, but that's not the main thing here. And that's why I tried to put it in a parenthetical almost, along with a lot of other issues. The point is, how are we going to resolve this? I thought there was a lot of consensus around the way in which we make the ratings isn't fair. It isn't accurate. It doesn't reflect school quality. And if we're going to fix that, there's a lot of different ideas on the table about how to do that. And one is a dashboard, but one is, changing the weights of the different indicators. One is adding different categories. Aaron had talked about adding getting rid of the all students category, or lowering. There's a lot of different ways to do it. So let me just say, we're going to continue this in the research committee, and then we'll come back at it in the July meeting. And I really want to say to everybody that has language concerns, I wish this support thing said more, please send me them, and I'll try to put them in this resolution. We'll have a revised resolution for next week. All right. Now we are late, not mainly because of this section, I want to say, but partly because of this section. I think we go on, quick on the social media policy, I believe, Jean-Paul, or we could even push that off or go to committees. Right?
It's up to you, Madam President. I mean, I can do it fairly quickly, I think.
I would suggest waiting because we'll want to talk about it. So why don't we, unless people want to, I would suggest let's put that off until next time and move to the committees.
Fine with me.
Objection, so. All right, social studies. Jessica.
Thank you, Ruth. So the Social Studies Standards Advisory Committee has been named. That is the headline. That is the big highline of this committee update. So I want to thank everybody, first our colleagues on the board and all the staff of the board for all of the work that you put in to helping us make the process of recruiting applicants for the pool, of reviewing the applications, of deciding on the panel of advisors. Your support was absolutely impressive, and we could not have done it without all of you. So thank you for that. Second, I want to extend thanks to the more than 100 people who applied for a seat on this Social Studies Standards Advisory Committee. We had DC residents, experts, educators, other stakeholders who all expressed their interest and took the time to describe why this work was important to them, what they thought they would bring to the work, and how they thought their experiences would contribute. And so we had a tremendously difficult job to review these applications and to decide who would be part of the advisory committee. We had a lot of interest from the public about the 26 members who were named to the committee. And so I want to make sure that we can direct both members and anyone in the public who is interested to sboe.dc.gov. If you go underneath our policy and research tab, you can find a link to click for social studies. Under there, you can read all about the work that we're about to undertake with reviewing the standards and leading to revisions. You can review all of the applications we've received for the Social Studies Standards Advisory Committee. They have been de-identified of folks' names, but otherwise you get all of the information people preferred to us in the application, including the race, ethnicity, professional expertise, et cetera, as well as the responses people gave to their the application questions. You can also read about our selection process, how we made the difficult decision to narrow more than 100 candidates down to 26. And you can read about the 26 members of the advisory committee. We're incredibly excited to welcome those 26 individuals to the first meeting of the Social Studies Standards Advisory Committee next Tuesday night. We'll be convening at 5 p.m. The public can participate via the SBOE's YouTube site. We'll be reaching out to the members of the advisory committee later this week with information on how to join the session, with an agenda for the session. And we'll be meeting with those folks every second Tuesday of the month from now through December. The chief charge for the Social Studies Standards Advisory Committee, which I know my colleagues on the board already know well, is to help the state board by drafting guiding principles for how we will revise the standards. In our resolution, SR 19-7, we talked about the things that the state board would like to see be different about the standards, but this is where we're getting the input from our expert advisors on how we should operationalize that. What would the guiding principles be for actually taking the old 2006 standards, updating and revising them to best fit the needs of students in the district from 2020 and beyond? We're also going to have this group make recommendations to the state board on how the standards should be revised. The state board will then review those revisions, adopt them, and present them to OSSE, and OSSE will lead the work on writing the new standards with input from experts, from educators in the city, et cetera. All of that information, again, is on our website, and so you can see that there. The last update I want to offer to my colleagues is that, similar to Ruth's point about the sort of rhythm of meetings, we'll have this initial meeting of the advisory committee on Tuesday the 7th. We'll then have our next meeting of the Social Studies Standards Committee on the 8th. So the draft agenda that I shared with members in last committee meeting is the one we'll be using for the advisory committee next Tuesday. I'll send you all the revised and updated version of that agenda. I practiced some things with the staff in our technical capacity. Turns out breakout rooms, not going to work this time. So I had to make a couple of tweaks to how we actually spend time in that first meeting. But I'll share that with all of you. We will have our committee meeting, though, the morning after this first advisory committee, and it'll be a great time for us to review what we did in that meeting and prepare for the next meeting. And that rhythm will continue throughout the work of the Standards Advisory Committee. We'll have the meeting on a Tuesday. Our committee meeting will follow the following Wednesday so that we can prepare for the next meeting. I do know Ruth had asked me one question that I want to make sure I address for everyone, which is about members of the board participating. We're going to continue to figure out how best to incorporate as many voices of state board members in the room for these meetings, whether that room is virtual or physical at some point during the process. For the first meeting, by all means, if you are interested in attending, love to have you. What we want to make sure to practice in all of these meetings is that we let the voices of our experts guide this work, and that we as the board are there as active listeners, taking in what we're hearing from the experts, and then working together in our board committee to prepare questions to bring back to them. Because I really want to make sure we maximize these 2-hour sessions we have with our advisory committee, rather than all of us who like to talk, myself included, sort of dominating conversation in the room. So I'm happy to answer any other questions folks have about the advisory committee. I, again, am just incredibly thankful for all the work you've put in so far to make this happen and come to life. I was so excited that the chancellor is excited about it. I've gotten emails from a lot of our advisors that they're excited to join us. So it's nice to see this work happening, and it would not have happened without all of you. So thank you. Marcus.
Hey, Jessica, thank you for that update. And I'll just tell you, I think since the announcement of the advisory committee came out, I've talked to several Ward 8 residents who are super excited that the work is beginning. Just for the record, for members of the general public who want to stay engaged with the work of the advisory committee, what opportunities are there for them to do that, to either follow the conversation or to provide input as this process goes along?
That's a great question, Marcus. Thank you. And I'm glad folks in Ward 8 are excited about this. So there's 3 ways I would suggest. One, the Social Studies Standards Advisory Committee meetings will be broadcast for the public on our YouTube site. And folks I hear like tonight are participating in the chat. We welcome that from the public in these advisory committee meetings as well. and that'll be on our SBOE YouTube page. I imagine we'll also promote it on our Twitter feed, so folks who follow us there can click through. Second, the landing page on our sboe.dc.gov site, again, under the Policy and Research tab, will be updated with documents pertaining to the committee so that members of the public can go there and see both the work coming ahead, process, documents, et cetera, as well as review meeting minutes, et cetera. And all of that is linked in there now. And then the third way is that as the advisory committee begins to bring together draft guiding principles, we're going to ask for their help in going out to engage the general public alongside board members to say, what do you think of these guiding principles? Where are we hitting the right notes? What have we missed? Are there things you expected to see in there that you don't yet? That we can bring it back to the advisory committee, revise, and make sure we're getting it right. That work's likely to happen in the fall because we want to get the advisory committee underway, and we know that summertime is already pretty complicated with reopening. So we'll let us get that under our belt before we actually ask more of the public.
No, that's great. I just wanted to make sure that all of that was reiterated for the record because I've had several questions and I'm sure some folks are watching tonight. So that was a really great synopsis. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Okay, so next is teacher retention, and I'm not sure, wait, is Fraser still here?
I believe Alex has the information.
What?
Alex will be giving the information.
Okay, Alex, and then I think the other Alex is also going to say something about the other resolution, follow up with that. Okay. And then just so people know, let me just say, as people are getting ready to leave, we've got that. And then I think we want to report from the Student Activities Committee, and then I know Marcus has new business on a resolution, and that's it. So everybody. Okay.
Okay. Can everybody hear me? Okay. So just a quick update from teacher retention. Yesterday evening, afternoon, Darren and I found out that we are going to be presenting at the 11th annual DC Data Summit. We have a proposal that was accepted to share and discuss the teacher retention survey data from February and March. And so we will be planning a session around that. It'll be about 90 minutes. The plan is to have Fraser engage in that conversation, as well as Simone, Darren, and I. But it will be an opportunity for us to publicly share that information with the public. The summit, I think, is July 20th through the 24th. It will be virtual. And I believe our session will be on the Wednesday, which I think is 22nd, sometime in the afternoon. And so we'll share more details.
All right, that's great. That's terrific. All right, Alex, other Alex? Alex O.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Alex J.
So a couple of days ago, or I guess it was like a week and a half ago, after the June public meeting, Jessica, Emily, and I had a call with Office of the Student Advocate with Dan and Philip Copeland, and they were interested in the recent resolutions we've had on supporting Black educators and supporting Latinx educators, and they were interested in further exploring these topics and doing more to support Black educators and sort of start like a campaign and partner with them to do various things. One of the things that they were talking about, which we discussed, was grow your own pipelines and how we can partner together with the Office of the Student Advocate to try to improve some of the current ones that exist, but also looking at some of the partnerships that colleges have, specifically American University and Trinity College, looking at how we can use some of the resources that are already in place and sort of starting a campaign to take next steps on what we can do to support Black educators specifically and Latinx educators, and improve recruitment and retention. I know that one thing I had, I sort of thought in our teacher retention committee, it may be helpful to look at specifically the barriers that exist for Black educators and Latinx educators, but also wondered if we could do more as a board also to explore some of the recruitment barriers that exist, more so than just resolutions on it, but actually looking at like task force that we can create. I just wanted to propose that idea that we continue doing more for these issues, and that this is like the start of something, and not just and just making sure the resolutions weren't the end of all we're doing as a state board to try to support our teachers of color.
Thank you, Alex.
Thank you, Alex. Sorry, I'm having a hard time unmuting there. Any questions, comments before I move on? That's great, and I'm glad you're tracking it, Alex. Okay, I think we are at new business.
Oh, so I guess this is my turn. So,
Yes, and can I just say the other thing is I know John Paul wants to give I'm sorry, I missed this. John Paul, a budget update and any other leadership report, any other executive director report?
Yes, I do have a couple things related to the budget. As members know, there was a change in the proposed budget at the Committee on Education, and we are still working with Chairman Mendelson and Chairman Grasso, as well as other members of the council to identify additional funding for the state board so that we can continue with our activities. And I'm fairly optimistic about that. There are lots and lots and lots of priorities related to our budget for FY21. I can't say it's going to be a guaranteed thing, but I feel fairly good about it. But I want to note that some of the information that we shared is pretty stark in terms of what would be available for us in FY21 if we did not receive the additional funding. So it could mean, an inability for us to do basic services like providing translations and interpretations. It would also mean likely that we would be unable to participate in NASB for next year because we wouldn't be able to afford the dues. It's also unclear whether or not we would be able to pay for Octo and DCHR services, which is a challenge to say the least. So I really do appreciate all the members talking with their respective council members to have them support our requests as well. I just wanted to make sure that update was done. I also want to note that I did talk to our newest student representative who will be joining us soon today. So Shayla Dell, who you all know because she testified before the board last month. She will be joining us as a student representative, and I will be talking with her in the coming weeks about setting up a virtual swearing-in ceremony so that she can officially join us. And I will make sure that you all have that information too, so you can join the call or watch it on YouTube as well. But we're really excited about her joining us for that purpose. So thank you, Madam President.
John Paul, quick follow-up question, and we could talk more about this offline. Are there ways, hypothetically, if we were to receive more money for research, to allocate some of that to plug in for some of those fundamental operations? And then secondly, is there, I'm glad to hear that you're feeling optimistic outside of, I guess, us talking to our respective council members. Are there other ways that we can support? It just seems to me the things that you just named, like Octo support, seems pretty fundamental to our operations. and I'm not clear how one might imagine the agency can keep moving forward without like technical support, for instance.
Thank you. That's a good question, and I'm glad you brought up the research. So Councilmember Che has identified $100,000 from her committee's budget that is also going to be added to the state board's budget. So this is the part where it gets a little wonky is the wrong word, but so we do have the mayor's budget for the state board's program activities was around $90,000. $50,000 of that was moved to the ombudsman and student advocates its offices to fill the holes that existed in their budgets because of the mayor's budget. And then we received $100,000 from Councilmember Che's office for research. So now we have a pool of $140,000. If $100,000 of that is devoted to the research, then that does only leave that $40,000. So if we are, for some reason, unsuccessful in finding, the council is unsuccessful in identifying additional funding, we do have a little bit of wiggle room, but that does come then at the cost of our research agenda.
Helpful, thank you.
All right. Now, new business, Marcus.
Yeah, and I just want to say thank you, John Paul. And I think given, I don't know if we made the announcement, but given that we really won't have a final look at what our budget numbers are going to look like, we thought that at the very, until probably late this month, we thought that at the very least it was appropriate for us to hold at least a short working session the first week of August to review the budget priorities. So we'll also be sending out an invite and information about that August working session as well, so that we all have the latest information on our final budget when that comes. All right. So in terms of new business, I circulated earlier this morning to all members a draft resolution related to police-free schools. So and again, I want to thank everybody for leaning into this conversation for the last month or so as we prepare to consider a resolution. So what you'll notice is quite a few whereases that really just outline the issue. That talk about the disproportionate negative impacts that policing in schools has had on particularly Black and Brown students, both nationally, but also here in the district. It also outlines pretty clearly the investment that our public school system is making on school policing, but also outlines very clear alternatives to policing in schools that can solve the issues that are most frequently thrown to police officers and security officers inside school buildings that don't need to be. And then moving very quickly to the therefores, it really recommends to the chancellor that the chancellor and other LEA leaders that they convene groups consistent of Black and Brown-led youth organizations, school leaders, student health experts, and community-based violent prevention professionals to create a student-centered set of recommendations and a plan for reimagining school safety with an immediate follow-up of that to recommending that the mayor terminate the MPD contract with DC Public Schools, and that the chancellor and other LEA leaders engage less in using millions of dollars to police our schools and investing in those things that we know work and make students feel safer, restorative justice approaches, well-being, mental health, et cetera, et cetera. And so as I mentioned in the email earlier today, I expect and look forward to engaging with all of you either tonight, but I know we're short on time, but also over the next couple weeks to really iron out this language with the hopes of passing this resolution during our July public meeting. So we had several students and members of the advocacy community come and speak to the importance of this, and there's been evolving conversations about this issue both here in our city and around the country, including in several districts that have already made moves to remove police completely from their school districts, and that's also listed in the resolution. But just thank everybody for leaning into this combo, and look forward to considering it later this month. I saw Jack saying.
Thank you, Marcus. And I'm really glad that we're taking on this type of work. This is a seminal moment in time, and I think this is the right, certainly, if now is not the right time to have this conversation, then when? I don't want us to also lose sight of the fact that as recently as 6 months ago, what I was hearing from constituents was related to Sandy Hook and school shootings and making sure that our students are safe and protected. Now, most of those school shootings aren't happening in urban areas. They're happening in suburban areas, right? But I just want to make sure we're cognizant of the fact that the last 3 months have been different, and rightly so. And also just ask us to make sure that if we're going to ignore the school shooting part, or not ignore, but not address that we're doing it in a conscious way and we're being deliberate about it. Because, I've had constituents come and talk to us about hardening the school, and making sure that classroom doors are solid, and, all of those types of things. So I'm with you. I just want to make sure, and maybe email's the best way to do that, is to perhaps have a phrase or a clause in there that addresses, that might acknowledge that for the past 10 years or so, and Emily, to your point, no, I don't think necessarily having police in schools does that, but a nod to the safety and security of our students would be helpful, I think.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think when it comes to like having this conversation, right, I think there's just a level of like, again, engagement in that reimagining that are just going to be very tough conversations about what student safety looks like. And for sure, I appreciate that. There's a whereas in the resolution that does speak to school shootings, and there's actually research done by the Advancement Project around policing in schools and school shootings. But again, there's a broader conversation that has to be had about, right, when removing police from schools, how do you also, right, maintain that sense of safety in the building for a random circumstance that could happen like that? So no, I think that's really important. So we do acknowledge that in the resolution for sure. But yeah, I mean, these just aren't going to be easy conversations to have with, right, your constituents, with mine, right, who, right, know the anxiety of having shootings around school buildings, right, and wanting students to be protected. So it's all, a very tough conversation, which is why we focus on like in the resolution, focus on kickstarting that process of reimagining, and not really, right, talking about kind of hard, barriers to that right now.
Agreed. And if I could just close up, I'd apologize for taking extra time here, but I don't think the conversation, I hadn't read the whole resolution. I just didn't have time today. So I appreciate you enlightening me. And I certainly don't want to slow down this resolution about policing in schools, because we have to do a little more discussion around gun violence in schools. I think the time is now. We should keep moving forward. And I don't want this to slow down our action.
For sure. No, I really appreciate that. Thank you. And yeah, I think, and again, I'm totally open to talking and discussing around those ideas, especially whatever you get from constituents, because that's really important as we, on the chance that we pass this later this month, we're able to really have really informed conversations and nuanced conversations with our folks. So, thanks. Emily?
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
Was there somebody before me?
It's like double dutch. No.
All right.
Go for it, Emily.
Oh, just really quick. I mean, it's sort of following up on this, what Jack mentioned about the tension between moving too quickly, but also, obviously, I mean, I think you're getting at this, Marcus, it has to be done thoughtfully. It's not something that we can afford to rush into. And Kathy Riley sent notes from the last SHAPE meeting where this was the topic of discussion, and there were close to a dozen principals, I want to say, in attendance who really, they're in support, most of them, not all of them actually, but the ones who are in support just really emphasize that there needs to be a period of discussion about, well, what's going to happen in place of that, right? And that they don't feel comfortable moving to get the police out before having that plan. So I just think that they are also direct stakeholders that we need to listen to.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that anxiety, and I won't speak for all of our school leaders, but I can imagine, and for some of the school leaders I've talked to, that anxiety also comes from losing the police presence inside the school with then no follow-up to provide those real supports that actually maintains student and school safety. And so I think you're absolutely right. There has to be a plan on how we phase in these measures and a plan on how we make bold investments on those things that we know create safety inside buildings, again, which is why that first therefore in that resolution is the starting point, where we talk about bringing folks to the table, coming up with a tangible plan, and then presenting that plan to the public. So absolutely, I think that's right.
Okay, if that is it, I think we are done. Any more new business? All right.
Just to jump in here, and I will be brief. I also support the resolution, Marcus. Thank you for your work here. I would say, though, given the timing of where we are with Councilmember Allen's efforts to reduce police budgets, with Councilmember Grasso and others who have already committed to revisiting the MPD contract with DCPS, I wonder where I would argue our value add is more in that whereas piece that you just mentioned, bringing the public along with us on this issue. I would say in conversations I've had recently with Ward 5 neighbors, everybody is not on board with this idea. And even amongst Black constituents and neighbors. And I've noticed, I don't think it's fair to say an age divide, but I'm finding that more of the constituents that are pushing back are some of our older residents, whereas maybe some of our younger residents are more for it. And so I just wonder what role, beyond bringing stakeholders to the table, could we play in educating the public? And I mean that in all the positive ways possible, to just bring them along on this topic.
Yeah,
I don't think that needs to delay. I don't think that needs to happen in order for us to vote. I think we could still vote on the resolution and maybe have some public forums where we educate people, for instance, on what Emily is talking about. What is that plan to replace the current structure? Or a question I've gotten, what is the role of the SRO in my school that's been there, that lives in the community, that knows the students? Or what are the expectations for school leaders or teachers when there are issues in the school? Things like that, where I think we can bring people along that would just provide a value add, in addition to us just passing the resolution.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think there are plenty of folks who are really diving into this work who I think would be open to coming into a space like this to talk more about what that looks like in a lot of different kind of theoretical situations. And then I'd also say it's not going to be an easy conversation, given that the institution of policing has just been, especially in communities of color, has just been the automatic, if there's a shooting, if there's sketchy folks, if they're then the automatic trigger is to engage the police department. And that's just not going to be an easy transition, but I think that there are just conversations that we've got to lean into and just say, well, look, if safety looked differently than the police, what could it look like? Starting there, as opposed to starting with, let's just cut out the police, The alternative as a means of safety, I think, is going to be a really important discussion. But yeah, no, I think let's for sure work together to figure out how we follow up this resolution with a meaningful discussion of what that looks like. Because I think you're absolutely right. There are tons of folks in communities where we would assume this would be a no-brainer who just have to be brought along. And it's going to take a lot of education and conversation around it. So absolutely.
Okay,
Yeah.
any further new business?
And I'll say I'm more than happy to host, given your suggestions. Thanks.
So moved. So moved.
Okay, well, I was going to say one thing on the resolution, but I'll pass it on to Marcus separately. All right. All those in favor of adjournment signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Good night, everybody. Thank you very much.